The House Oversight Committee will come to order. Mr. Gort, please take attendance.
Chair Johnson.
Here.
Representatives Outman. Here. Hoytniga.
Here.
Riley.
Here.
Yarrick.
Here.
O'Malley.
Here.
Brixey.
Here.
LeGrand. Young.
Here.
Mr. Chair, quorum of the committee is present.
And Representative Hoytniga moves to adopt the minutes from the January 13, 2022 committee hearing. Seeing no objection, the minutes are approved. Today we do have a joint hearing with the Senate. They just adjourned from session about 5 minutes ago, so they are walking over here. So we will go at ease until they are here. With that, we'll go at ease, call the chair.
Good morning, Madam Clerk.
Hello, Mr. Chairman.
Please call the roll.
Chair McBroom.
Here.
Senator Tice.
There.
Senator Tice. Senator Bizan.
Present.
Senator Wozniak. Senator Irwin.
Here.
Senator Chang. Here. Mr. Chairman, there are 5 members present. You have a quorum.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. I'd like a motion to adopt the committee minutes from January 18th. So moved by Senator Bizan. Hearing no objection, the minutes are adopted. I'd like a motion to excuse absent members. So moved by Vice Chair Irwin. Hearing no objections, absent members are excused. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The House Oversight Committee will come back to order. For the record, Representative LeGrand is on via Zoom. All right, today we are going over an Auditor General report. I'd like to go over just a quick timeline as to what brought us here. So going back, the first thing we could find was April 14, 2020, a letter from Senator Tice to Governor Whitmer calling on her to not be placing COVID-positive patients into nursing homes because it's a vulnerable population. Unfortunately, that very next day, April 15, 2020, Executive Order 2020-50 was issued by Governor Whitmer, and this required that long-term care facilities had to accept COVID-positive patients. The very next day, April 16, 2020, a letter by Melissa Samuel, President and CEO of the Healthcare Association of Michigan, writing to Governor Whitmer regarding her concerns with Executive Order 2020-50. And I quote, "This provision will introduce COVID-19 into units where it is not yet present, endangering residents who are the most vulnerable to this virus." The letter goes on to state, and I quote, "will mandate the spread of COVID-19. Further, quote, this section is essentially a mandate that facilities take COVID-19 affected residents even if the facility is COVID-19 free." On June 15, 2020, Governor Whitmer issues Executive Order 2020-123, which extended the requirement to place COVID-positive patients into nursing homes. Also in June, the Senate passed Senate Bill 956, which would have prohibited COVID-positive patients from going into nursing homes. The governor ended up vetoing that bill. Fast forward to last year, May 25, 2021, there was an article in Deadline Detroit by Charlie LaDuff detailing that Michigan was not having a proper account of nursing home deaths. Now this also came near the same time that we heard of Governor Cuomo in New York, also not counting nursing home deaths, and that was purposeful. This led the House Oversight Committee to begin our investigation. On June 3, 2021, before our committee, we had Steve DeLee with the Mackinac Center, and he kind of gave a report of the information they had found to that point. And that's where we began to see how these nursing home deaths are counted. Now, to be clear, when I say nursing homes, I'm referring to long-term care facilities. That is a technical term. I think normal people just say nursing homes. The way that the numbers were being presented is only what skilled nursing homes report, what some homes for the aged report, and what some adult foster care facilities report. We knew, the department knew, and presented to the public and to us a nursing home number that they knew did not include all facilities. Furthermore, DHHS did not actually verify these self-reported numbers. A week later, on June 10, is when I sent this letter to the Auditor General's office asking that we get a count of all long-term care facility deaths. All of these long-term care facilities were subject to Executive Order 50. Therefore, they should all be counted, not just those that were required to self-report. This past Monday, the Auditor General finally gave us the report. This is over half a year in the making. This report was not rushed. They took their time, they were thorough, they were diligent. The Auditor General's office was tasked with this because they're independent, they're nonpartisan, they're unbiased. There is no one better to conduct this report than the Auditor General. With that, I'd like to invite the Office of the Auditor General up to review this report with us. Thank you for being here this morning. Thank you for the work you've done compiling this report, and we look forward to hearing about this. Thank you.
Thank you to the two chairs and the committees for our opportunity to discuss the work we did regarding the COVID-related deaths linked to long-term care facilities. I'm Doug Ringler, I'm Michigan's Auditor General. With me is Laura Hirsch, she's our Deputy Auditor General. And on the end, we have Brittany Simon, who was our lead field person on this project. As a matter of a very brief introduction, our office was established in the Michigan Constitution. We report in a nonpartisan fashion to the legislature. We provide the legislature and the public with independent, objective, and transparent information. With the chair's approval, I'd like to ask Brittany to provide about a 5-minute overview of the field work we conducted in relation to this letter. I'll take about 5 minutes to go through the letter and point out some of the key contents, and then we'll be available for questions. So with that, I'll turn it over to Brittany.
Thank you, and thank you for having us. So we started our review by first meeting with various MDHHS management and staff and obtained an understanding of the policies and procedures regarding COVID-19 death reporting in general, as well as related to long-term care facilities. So to verify that we had a complete starting population of total COVID-19 deaths, we analyzed death certificate data from Michigan's electronic death registration system, so EDRS, and COVID-19 case and death data from the Michigan Disease Surveillance System, MDSS, and performed data matches between the two systems based on first name, last name, and date of birth. We compared MDSS data to the Michigan coronavirus website, and we ensured that all COVID-19 deaths identified by MDHHS in MDSS had a death certificate and removed from our count any COVID-19 deaths reported by MDHHS that did not have a death certificate on file in EDRS. We also removed any duplicate records that we had found. We then used the MDSS and EDRS data and the COVID-19 case surveillance definitions, so the same definitions that MDHHS is using to identify COVID-19 deaths, to determine any additional COVID-19 deaths, which would be those that were not previously reported on the dashboard. So we reconciled the total COVID-19 deaths that MDHHS reported on the Michigan coronavirus dashboard to within 3.2%, confirming that we had a complete starting population. So our next step was to determine which of the total COVID-19 deaths were linked to long-term care facilities. And so based on the definition of a long-term care facility included in the executive orders issued during the pandemic, we defined a long-term care facility as a nursing home or skilled nursing facility, home for the aged facility, adult foster care facility, or an assisted living facility. And also, based on MDHHS's guidance provided to the long-term care facilities, we determined that MDHHS was not requiring adult foster care facilities with 12 or fewer beds, certain home for the aged facilities, and hospice-only nursing homes to report their information to MDHHS. For the identified long-term care facility types, we worked with LARA to obtain licensing information, including facility names, addresses, and bed counts. In working with LARA, we learned that there was a subset of home for the aged facilities, which were licensed by the state at one point and had subsequently received an exemption from licensing requirements due to a change in law. We also learned that LARA does not license assisted living facilities, and therefore we were not able to obtain a listing of assisted living facilities from LARA. And so absent a complete listing, we excluded that facility type from our analysis. Once we had the long-term care facility types and licensing data, we worked to identify COVID-19 deaths linked to a long-term care facility. Using the 21,577 total COVID-19 deaths, we performed various data analytics and manual reviews of names and address fields to determine if any of the data overlapped with a long-term care facility name or address. So more specifically, we used the EDRS data to identify records where the location of death or the current residence identified on a death certificate matched a long-term care facility. We used address fields from the MDSS data to identify the records where the residence matched a long-term care facility. We also reviewed, when necessary, the remaining EDRS and MDSS records with other MDSS data fields, Medicaid beneficiary data and bridges, and Medicaid long-term care claims and CHAMPS. In performing these steps, we were able to identify a population of COVID-19 deaths linked to a long-term care facility. And the Auditor General will now go through our letter.
Okay, thanks, Brittany. I'd like to begin by reiterating that this was not an audit of the process the department followed to compile deaths and report them, to compile deaths from some of the long-term care facilities and report them on the state's coronavirus dashboard. Instead, what we did was we conducted a review at the request of Chair Johnson, as he mentioned, using various data systems, as Brittany identified, in an attempt to identify previously unreported deaths linked to long-term care facilities. You should have the letter that we sent to Chair Johnson in front of you, and I'll go through that now briefly. The front page is a recap of our 12-page letter. We also mentioned in the recap that we provided details to the department for each of the 8,061 deaths cited later in our letter. These details included the specific data fields that we used, that we matched in the source of the data. Move over to page 1. There's some additional background information. What we did was we recapped the number of facilities in each long-term care facility type, and we further separated it by those required to report and those not required to report. With this table and many others within this letter, you'll note there are many footnotes that attempt to identify the assumptions or nuances to the figures that we used that would warrant further explanation. On to page 3. This is the table that shows the total deaths we identified from our work with a breakdown of those required to report. The analysis we did to identify all the COVID-related deaths, as Brittany mentioned. We used this as a starting point to then, as she said, go through the next phase of our review. On page 3, this table shows the total deaths we identified in our work with a breakdown, again, of those required to report and those not required to report. I wanted to draw your attention for a second to the group in the middle, identified as undetermined. Those are deaths when where facilities that provide services that were both required to report and not required to report, what happens is that when the person completing the death certificate, they may use a generic address, and it would be an address for the campus, and it wouldn't specifically identify the facility or the service within that campus that related to that particular person. So again, in the interest of trying to be transparent, we put that in a separate bucket so people could see where that fell. Those numbers on there should be in either the top section or the bottom section. We just couldn't determine which section. So moving on to page 4. It highlights the analysis we went through, and I think Brittany hit you a highlight of those as well, to identify the COVID deaths linked to long-term care facilities. There's also limitations that we encountered regarding our data analytics. There's a narrative about the department's disagreement with how we use the MDSS data, and our contention as to why we believe that to be a valid data source. The third bullet from the bottom talks about other uses that HHS has for the information contained within that system. And the last bullet discusses our analysis to corroborate at least 85% of the address fields to other department systems and even within other fields within MDSS. We're on to page 5. I'll admit page 5 has a lot of information and numbers. It identifies the source and the data fields we use that we matched to derive the 8,061 deaths in our letter. Again, we included this to provide complete transparency as to what we did to reach the numbers that we cited in our letter. On to page 6, provides a discussion about the reporting of overall COVID deaths and deaths linked to long-term care facilities. The second paragraph from the bottom cites one of the challenges in performing data matches because of the lack of detailed information regarding the decedent, such as their name, date of birth, and social security number. Page 7, we noted in page 7 that MDHHS accurately reported on the coronavirus dashboard the 5,675 deaths that were self-reported to them. We also identified work that the department performed in an attempt to compare death records with the self-reported numbers. On page 8, the table itself is pretty self-explanatory. It's a population of the Michigan facilities included in our review and the date they were required to first report, if applicable. Page 9 has some codes that you see, and what they are those codes are used within the tables, and they further define the types of populations and the circumstances around those folks that are reflected in the table, or the tables. And then 10 through 12 are glossary items. Just would like to wrap up and say that I'd like to thank Lara for their assistance with helping us identify the long-term care facilities that were licensed during the pandemic, and for providing key licensee information. I'd also like to thank MDHHS for their time in addressing our questions and otherwise assisting us in our work. And then lastly, regarding the work and integrity of the healthcare officials providing frontline services to patients across the state, or those responsible for running the business side of these facilities, needing to report the information. I'll speak on behalf of our office and just say that we're all indebted to them and applaud their efforts to try to care for our families, friends, and colleagues. With that, Chairs, I'll return it back to you for any questions that you may have.
Thank you for the report, and I really appreciate page 3, the breakdown of everything there. Obviously, everyone's focusing on the 8,061 deaths versus the reported 5,600. This is really good where we can kind of see where those facilities were. I want you to touch on the MDSS address field. There's some controversy regarding whether that was an accurate way to count things. Could you touch on why you believe that was a good measurement to use?
Yeah, I'm trying to find the page for real quick. Okay. We talk about in there the other uses that MDHHS has for that. They use it for contact tracing, geographic reporting, those types of things. And we felt that if they could use it for those purposes, that we could also rely on it then for the address information. As we indicated in the bottom of that page as well, we corroborated at least 85%, and it was actually probably more than that. We did a relatively quick analysis, and we were able to corroborate at least 85% of those addresses to other systems, and also within MDSS itself. So we felt that that was a good source. Did you guys want to add?
I'll just add one thing, that this does not mean that we were not able to corroborate 15%. We just simply were comfortable enough with 85% to move forward.
So, and I want to figure out this address field within MDSS, who would enter that in?
Good.
So the address field is typically populated from laboratory results. So when an individual goes and gets their COVID-19 test done, the lab is going to take your information. That information is compiled and put into a specific format that MDHHS collects. It then can be automatically updated into the MDSS system. Once in the MDSS system, the case will go to the local health departments, and the local health departments at that point will perform additional investigation that might be needed to learn more information about the COVID positive patient. So at that point in time, the local health department worker, they can update the address if needed to correct anything, but it's based on all the information that then would have been collected at that time.
So I know at one point in this committee we had heard about individuals who resided in a long-term care facility, but when they put their address down, sometimes they'd put the home that they were living in because that's what they're used to writing. That kind of makes sense, right? But if you're putting down the long-term care facility address, you clearly are probably there. I mean, no one's going to make that mistake of, oh, I put down the nursing home address, but really I don't live there. I mean, that'd be pretty rare for that to occur.
I think your comment stands to reason. That certainly the address that was included wasn't the address to this building, for example, or my address or your address. It did link to a long-term care facility.
So let's say in the instance where someone put their old address, right? So let's say they're at ABC nursing home, but they don't know the address there. They lived for 70 years on Main Street. They put that address down. Would you guys have been able to flag that as a long-term care death, or would that perhaps fall through the cracks?
No, it would have fallen through the cracks because it didn't link back to an address to a long-term care facility.
Okay. Furthermore, on that chart, there's assisted living facilities. If you see under there, there's no numbers. You kind of talked about that. So evidently the department was requiring assisted living facilities to report up until October of 2020, and it looks like they actually didn't get any reporting numbers, and then that went away. Can you touch on how that all worked?
Our footnote does cite exactly what you said too about it not being required to report after October 20th. Brittany, anything else?
Correct.
Were there any reports before October? I mean, do we see any deaths linked to assisted living facilities?
We inquired to MDHHS and asked if they had collected any of the information from assisted living facilities, and they informed us that they had not. So there was no additional information, I guess, for us to collect or glean off of. And as I mentioned, since we did not have a complete population of those facilities, we were not able to perform our analysis on them.
So just make sure it's clear, you don't have a database of all these facilities, so you can't, check those addresses versus the death certificate addresses, right? That's what's going on here.
Correct, yep.
So there's a whole bucket here, and I'm looking at the EO definition of long-term care facility, and it includes assisted living facilities. So it looks like there's actually a bucket that we're unable to count at this point. For whatever reason, it would take too long to try to figure out what all those facilities are.
We wouldn't have an automated means of identifying all those addresses, as our footnote indicates, because they weren't licensed. We just wouldn't have a repository of those addresses.
Okay. Senator?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the Auditor General and your team. When the Senate Oversight Committee held hearings on this subject matter in the spring of 2020, the department repeatedly told us that they were not able at that time to do a good job with their counting. They understood that, they recognized that they were having a lot of trouble getting good data and their systems weren't in place and they were trying to play catch up. Do you know from your research and doing this and doing the count whether or not they ever went back and updated or corrected the numbers that they had from those early days?
I'd prefer that you ask the department that.
Okay. I'll ask you then.
Okay.
Do your numbers go back to those early days during that time period?
Our numbers start with January 1st of 21, and they run through July 2nd of 21.
So January 21 through July of 21?
I'm sorry, 20. Thanks.
Okay, okay. So they do cover that early first 3 months time period.
It actually goes back a little bit before what most people use as the date as the onset of the pandemic, which is typically referred to as March.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Members have questions? Yeah. Representative Brixey.
Thank you very much, Chair Johnson. I have a couple of questions that I want to make perfectly clear to be sure that I understand. So on page 4 of the report, you note that you were not able to exclude individuals who recovered from COVID-19 and returned home to be with their families or were discharged to hospice. Correct? Yes. Okay, I see. Could you answer yes instead of nodding your head, because we have people on Zoom?
Yes.
Thank you so much. And then you also weren't able to exclude those people who went to the hospital but for something and then later were diagnosed with COVID-19.
Yeah, the last bullet on that in the middle of the page says we weren't able to identify when, where, and how the long-term care facility resident contacted COVID. You're correct.
Okay, and so then the last one is that you weren't able to exclude from your count COVID-19 deaths that occurred at independent living facilities or assisted living facilities that have the same address as a licensed long-term care facility.
Yes, as I explained earlier, sometimes they use a general address that covers multiple aspects of their campus. And so sometimes, well, not sometimes, we weren't able to differentiate perhaps where that particular client
Right.
was within that campus.
My parents live in a place like that. There's my grandparents lived in one. There's a lot of great places like that around, and my observation of most of those places is that the independent living portion is usually much larger and has a larger population than the assisted living and then the nursing component.
I believe in the epidemic, when they came to the epidemic orders, they eliminated independent living from the definition, right? That wasn't part of the definition of long-term care. Assisted living facilities were, but independent living was not.
So none of these types of places meet the federal definition of the reportable long-term care facility death.
The
Independent living.
The CDC definition was focused on CMS certified nursing facilities. And then the department expanded their reporting expectations beyond the CDC requirement.
Okay, so as it relates to the counting and the overcounting that your report acknowledges occurred because you weren't able to exclude them, you faced some limitations in accurately counting. Do you know how many, do you have any idea of how many, did you make an attempt of how many deaths were overcounted based on these types of things you weren't able to exclude?
No, we weren't. We did data analytic work. We didn't look at specific cases that would have probably been necessary to do that type of an elimination.
Okay, so that means then that your count is overstated by an unknown amount.
Representative, that's not true. We are going through this here. So if you're going through the numbers, we want to make sure we're being accurate here. We already listed there's several limitations to this, right? If someone doesn't put down a long-term care facility address, but they instead put down the home that they lived in for 50 years, which is something you actually brought up in the June 3rd committee as a very likely opportunity that would happen, those names wouldn't be included. Assisted living facilities, because we don't have a database of all those facilities, were not counted. That's actually probably a huge bucket out there, and that was included under the executive order definition of long-term care facility. Is this 8,061 number going to be exactly accurate to each individual? Highly unlikely, but this is the most accurate count we have as to date. It's my understanding the number could actually be higher than what we see here. But you know what? We actually finally have someone willing to go in and try to get a somewhat accurate count. What the department did was nothing. All they did is they said, all right, those facilities that are required to self-report, we're just going to take your numbers and put them online and say that's the number. Didn't lift a finger to actually verify, hey, are these self-reported numbers accurate? Hey, maybe we should look at those facilities that were subject to the EO that don't have to self-report. None of that happened. This right here is the best we've seen yet. I'd like to get even more information. I'd love to get that breakdown. But for you to try to come in here and say, well, this is being overstated, it's actually probably the exact opposite. It's probably being understated. Representative Brixey.
Okay. Mr. Chair, I would appreciate it if when I have the floor, you would allow me.
I would allow you to, but when you're saying things that are blatantly false, I have to step in, okay? So, Representative, I'm going to go back to you.
Regarding the counting exclusions that we were discussing in the audit, so you stated that you faced you're unable to accurately put a number on how many deaths were overcounted in your report. And so my next question is, that means your count is overstated by an unknown amount.
I think, to be fair, it would be safe to say there are undercounting and overcountings that occur because of various circumstances. We've articulated some of those. We've talked about even some of those just today. That certainly is is a limitation of doing the data analytics. What we tried to do in our letter is to identify limitations that we had.
Right, and I appreciated that because you're clearly disclosing this independent assisted living, the tiered places. These are a lot of common places. We have a number of them in my district. So since the struggle I'm having here is that since the count is overstated by an unknown amount, I don't know why we would place credibility on the numbers because of those known limitations. You know, I'm a scientist, and we always say there's an acceptable amount of error that you can have that's standardly accepted. So there's an overcount and an undercount, but we don't know by how much. And it seems like the audit is really comparing apples to oranges because we're using a different definition. You've been asked, it isn't like you're doing this on your own volition, you've been asked to do this analysis, and you're using a different definition than the federal one that MDHHS is using. And it seems like the whole purpose of the federal definitions are to rigorously follow it so that all of the states can compare data. Now, if this body is interested in changing the way our independent living facilities, our assisted living facilities, our foster cares, all these different types of places where folks like to live, perhaps we should begin to regulate them and require them to fall under this definition.
Representative, we have a few clarifying points to your comments, if we could, please.
Yes. So first, I'd like to clarify for CMS required reporting. When CMS put out the requirements for COVID-19 reporting, they were essentially just asking for nursing homes. So in their actual May 2020 FAQ document, they acknowledge that when they say nursing home, it's used interchangeably with long-term care facilities. So I just want to make sure that that's clear, that the CMS reporting requirements were specific to nursing homes. Even though they might use the term long-term care facility, in that instance, long-term care facility to the federal Centers for Medicaid and Medicaid Services, so CMS, was used differently than what Michigan defined a long-term care facility as. So I just wanted to make sure that that is clear. As well as, you know, so since MDHHS, in addition to Michigan, elected to use a different definition for long-term care facilities, which would then include our home for the aged facilities and our adult foster care facilities and our assisted living facilities. That also meant that then that MDHHS was collecting data, self-reported data, differently than how the federal government was requiring them to ask. So therefore, in terms of there being differences about being reported by states, you know, Michigan had already acknowledged that they were reporting and collecting data differently than other states and what the federal government had required. And so I just want to make sure that that was clear. And then one other thing on performing, like the limitation. So yes, you know, we acknowledged that the independent living facilities were not required to self-report, nor were they included in the long-term care definition. However, those would just be one type of building on those campus facilities. So when we're talking about the campus facilities, you know, you're going to have you may have a nursing home, you may have a home for the aged facility, you may have an assisted living facility, and those facilities were all required to report. It just simply be the other additional ones, which could include then
right, and the independent living ones are typically the largest ones because as these folks who are living in these places age, you know, they don't all make it to the next tier of living. And I know that my parents are choosing to live in this type of a tiered facility. And again, there's probably 5 times more people living in the independent part than in the nursing wing or the assisted living wing of the facility.
I'd just like to add to Brittany's thing, we did provide all of the detail related to all 8,061 deaths to the department at the end of November, so there is an opportunity to research and maybe look forward to kind of put a number on those limitations if the department so chooses.
And I just want to make sure there's a clarification here. The reason we're asking for all these facilities to be counted, I understand the federal government only requires some of them, but this is in reaction to Governor Whitmer's executive order that placed COVID positive patients into long-term care facilities. That definition that was used in the EO applied to all of these. Now, the federal government doesn't require this because most states didn't do this policy. That's the big difference here. Michigan was one of a handful of states that decided to put COVID positive patients into these facilities. For us to not count them would be insane. If you don't count these, what you're saying is, well, that person's life in that facility was somehow less valuable than the life of the facility that was required to self-report. In what world would that make any sense? Remember, we were told over and over, all these EOs were being drafted and being implemented because they're using the data. The data out there is driving this. Well, we want to know, what is the data? And the data shows this was a deadly decision. And we wanted to make sure this never happens again, we have accurate information. Now, I think we may have to try and find even better information to get to a closer number. But this right here, this 8,000 number, is far closer to being accurate than the 5,600 number. We know without a doubt that that number did not include a number of facilities. That number, by definition, has to be low. Senator?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I just want to emphasize that I think that the potential of getting bogged down here today in discussing numbers we don't have, assisted living facilities, and then what the Auditor General has printed for us out here as uncertain facility type is not really the point. And I think you were just making that. The numbers that we do have are troubling enough alone, standing alone, and to get distracted by talking about how neither side has assisted living facility numbers or the 128, which is a pittance out of the more than 1,000 that's been identified as a discrepancy, is not really the issue today. The issue today is why there's such a large discrepancy to begin with. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Yarrick.
Yes, I want to follow up on a question that was previously asked. Page 4 of your report says excludes instances where a resident of LTC facility tested positive for COVID-19 was discharged from the facility and passed away at home or another location. The question was asked to you, but it was included in the question said, and had recovered from COVID. Now that is actually, do you want to pull up that section?
I'm on page 4, I'm sorry.
Okay. Bullet point 3 under perform only data analytics resulting in certain data limitations we were not able to, and the third bullet point under that. Now, it says excludes instances where a resident of LTC tested positive for COVID-19 was discharged from the facility and passed away at home or another location. The question that was posed to you previously by another member stated included the word and recovered, which is the language of the DHHS letter, but is not the language in your letter. So my question is, could you clarify as to which is correct? I have a DHS letter saying that you weren't able to exclude it because they tested positive and recovered, and your letter does not say and recovered. So could you talk a little bit more about that data point?
Sure.
Yes. So one thing I want to circle back to is that we started with the total COVID-19 death population that was reconciled with what MDHHS was reporting on the Michigan Coronavirus Dashboard. And as indicated in our chart, we identified a few additional, but a majority of the total COVID-19 deaths that we included in our review were identified by MDHHS as such. Therefore, MDHHS had indicated that the individual was a COVID-19 death. So specifically, our bullet here, when we say was discharged, what that means is then that we took that positive COVID-19 death, again, a majority of them identified by MDHHS as such, and we just simply weren't aware or could know that discharge information. So again, MDSS indicated them as a COVID-19 death, and we just simply didn't know if they passed away while they were still a resident or if they may have been discharged and died at home. So the recovered piece here is not what is in this bullet. That is not what our limitation here was. So again, going back to that, we started with our population of total COVID-19 deaths that MDHHS had on their dashboard. So that would mean that MDHHS had indicated those as COVID-19 deaths. And we simply just took that and said their address was a long-term care facility. And we just simply didn't know if they passed away literally in the facility, or maybe they did pass away in a hospital or at their home.
Well, the question I'm raising is because DHS, in their letter, suggests individuals who discharged from a long-term care facility. This category includes former residents who recovered from COVID-19, and they're suggesting that that category that you weren't able to exclude included the people that actually had recovered and were sent home. And I'm trying to clear, and you were asked the question by one of my colleagues saying that they weren't excluded. But as my understanding, you're not saying that you were excluding people who had recovered from COVID-19 and were sent home.
The 30-day look back.
Yeah.
I'm trying to reconcile these two statements.
Correct. So to rephrase, we did not include individuals in our count who may have recovered. So by therefore, we could never exclude them because they never were included to begin with.
Okay, so that would be an incorrect statement in DHS's letter, that you hadn't included people who had recovered from COVID-19 and passed it home.
I believe so. The population we started, that criteria had already been taken into consideration. So somebody at DHHS had already gone through and said, these people recovered, they're not reported as deaths, and then we started with the deaths that were COVID-19 deaths.
Okay.
So that.
All right, I just want to clarify, because one of my colleagues asked you regarding that category, but included the words "and recovered,"
right,
which is actually not your statement, it is DHS's statement. Okay, thank you. I'm all set, thank you.
Yeah, I think the key there, if you recovered and then passed away, that wouldn't be a COVID death, and so that wouldn't be in this population. Do you have members, Senator, questions?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Vice Chair Irwin, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I appreciate that, you did this review. We're sitting here in a state so many months after I think a lot of us hoped that this would all be over, and after many of us have unfortunately minimized the seriousness of this virus. And now here we are again talking about all the tragic deaths that have resulted from this coronavirus pandemic. So, it's obviously a somber subject, but I do want to make sure that we get accurate data and that your report is accurate. And I've got some real concerns about the accuracy of your report. And frankly, my concerns about the accuracy of your report are punctuated by the admissions in your report that your report is not accurate. But my first question is, why did you decide to rely so heavily on the Michigan Disease Surveillance System, a system used for surveillance and public health tracking and tracing? And what did you do to verify the accuracy of that information? Did you talk to any of the individuals who input that information? Did you pull a sample of these deaths and actually go and analyze those very closely to make sure that this information was accurate?
I'd like to refer you to page 5, and I'm going to have Brittany chime in here about how we matched various fields. You can see that over half of the number is actually a match between addresses on the MDSS and the death records, and so I think the characterization you used is relied so heavily. There was about half of them that had that match alone. Go ahead, Brittany, and I'll ask you to talk about the rest of the matches of complicated.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, so as the Auditor General mentioned, on page 5, a little over 4,000 of our total 8,000 had address fields that matched a long-term care facility from both EDRS and MDSS, so both the death certificate and the Michigan Disease Surveillance System. And then, continuing on, we had the EDRS data of the 1,500, MDSS of the 1,500. We did meet with numerous individuals from HHS to discuss the MDSS system, to learn about the different data fields and what they're being used for, and also the limitations or items that would relate to that. So using the information that we had obtained from MDHHS, we felt comfortable with using MDSS as a reliable system. We acknowledge that it's not typically used for collecting and analyzing death certificate data, that it is a surveillance system. However, that did not limit our ability to use an address field to do a match to a long-term care facility.
But once again, did you actually go back and pull a sample of these cases that you've identified here that have that address match and analyze that sample to determine that determine the accuracy of the MDSS data?
We did not.
Okay.
We did not pull a specific sample. However, again, knowing that we had other corroborating evidence of that address field. So in MDSS, you first collect personal identifying information. So the person's name, their residence, those types of things. Then when local health department individuals are doing additional follow-up on a case, they will collect additional information. So there's a separate section within the MDSS system that is also collecting information and asking the questions, do you reside in a long-term care facility? And the individual is going to answer yes or no. And based on those types of questions, then you're collecting more information. If you indicate yes, then the health department was asking, okay, what's the name of the facility you reside in? What is the address of that specific facility? So there's also additional information in MDSS system itself that is going to help to corroborate that initial personal identifying address that you may have inputted into there.
Sure, but I think that explanation does sort of alight some of the weaknesses of the data because, of course, someone else is going to report that after the case. So just to get a little bit into this earlier question, if an individual is discharged from one of these facilities or a facility that shares an address with one of these facilities, and then subsequently, gets COVID outside of the facility, would they be listed in MDSS as a COVID death? Because here, I'll just read to you the letter from our department says, individuals who are hospitalized for a non-COVID-19 reason, such as a fall, and then subsequently acquired COVID-19 outside the facility after release are included. Are those included?
Yes, we said that we weren't able to identify when, where, and how the person contracted COVID. Right. I'd like to go back to your previous question, if I can, for just a second. You talked about doing a sample. If we had done that, given the individual circumstances of these cases, we certainly wouldn't have been in any position to extrapolate what that sample of 50 or 25 or whatever the number is, how that would have impacted the entire population.
Look, I'm very familiar with your office coming before us and saying we had 10,000 pieces of data, we analyzed 50 of them, and we think that they're representative of the total. If you're telling me that that doesn't work in this case, that's fine, but I don't understand why, and I'm not going to get there today. Okay. So we already know the individuals who were hospitalized.
Senator Irwin,
yeah.
Could I just piggyback on one of your questions for a second?
Yeah, please.
Just for clarity, for my sake, what you had said regarding MDSS being a system where there's additional questions where they actually ask, are you a resident of a long-term care facility? Is that a field that you utilized? So I mean, in the hypothetical scenario where somebody has gone home, they would answer no to that question.
But they're dead, they can't answer.
Okay.
So I'll have two points here. First point is if an individual went from a nursing home into a hospital and they contracted COVID at the hospital and never went back to the nursing facility, they were already, discharged, you wouldn't include the address as a long-term care facility because you were already discharged at that time. So if the expectation was that you would go back to the nursing home, then yes, maybe you would. But if you were getting discharged from a hospital to, a personal residence or something else, you wouldn't have included that long-term care residence because you would have already been discharged. Now going to your point of the MDSS data, So we relied on first the personal identifying information, first that address. There is in MDSS the question that says, are you in a long-term care facility, yes or no? We relied on the additional data fields that would have been collected as part of that, but only in regards to if somebody had listed an address or listed a name. So for example, if in MDSS it said, are you a resident of a long-term care facility? And it indicated yes, but there was no additional fields collected there. If the address previously didn't match, we wouldn't have just added them. We wanted to make sure that every single one of our counts matched a long-term care address. So there's additional check boxes and everything in MDSS. We did not use those to solely identify any of our 8,000. Again, we wanted to make sure that every single one of our 8,000 had an address or name that matched a long-term care facility.
But once again, if someone did not check the box saying that the person who had died, once again, the person who died isn't filling this out, someone else is. If someone did not check the box saying that they were a resident of a long-term care facility, but then subsequently you found an address match, which could have been the fact that they failed to check the box, or it could have been just that they were in an independent living facility on the same address, you did count those in your total, correct?
So one thing I want to make clear is that when information gets put into MDSS, it's based on a positive COVID-19 test. So MDSS does not start with a death. So when you're collecting information in MDSS, it's based on when you had your positive COVID-19 test results. So therefore, indicating that you are part of a long-term care facility, at that time, the person was living. So either they themselves are sharing that information, or maybe they have a family member who, communicates on their behalf. So in that case, that information would already have been there. And if it indicated a long-term care facility, if that checkbox again was checked yes, and it did not have any other identifying information to link it to a long-term care facility, we did not include them because we did not feel like a simple checkbox was sufficient evidence to support that the person was a resident of a long-term care facility.
Okay, thank you. And so if an individual is discharged from a facility prior to their death and subsequent to recovering from COVID-19, and let's say they're a cancer patient, they get discharged to hospice, and they later die in hospice, DHHS is representing that those individuals are included in your total. Is that accurate?
Again, it would go back to the address that the person identified on their death certificate as their residence would be the first.
Was that a yes?
Well, I'm trying to answer your question, but I mean, to lay the different criteria on top of it is not as straightforward as a yes or no.
Well, that's why I laid the criteria, so that you would have enough information to give me a yes or no, and it wouldn't just be sort of like it depends on the criteria. The criteria are that an individual is discharged from a facility after recovering from COVID-19, they're sent to hospice, they later die in hospice of cancer. Is that individual included in your total? DHHS says it is. Your report seems to suggest it is, and I'm asking you in committee, yes or no, is it?
Again, though, it would be driven by the address that they included on the death certificate as their residence.
Okay. In your original report, Mr. Ringler, it's been shared with me that initially you used the word underreport, and I don't see the word underreport anywhere in this report. Why didn't you use the word underreport?
Well, first of all, for the long-term care facility-related deaths or linked deaths, we knew the department wasn't tracking all of the ones that we reflected in our letter, so we didn't feel the word underreport was fair. We cited it as a difference.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that, because the other thing I appreciate in your report is that you very strongly indicate that DHHS accurately reported what they were supposed to report under the law and did so with fidelity. And so if our effort here in Michigan is to make sure that all of our COVID reporting is accurate, I think that we should do that, and I think we should also make sure that our data is comparable with what other states are doing, so that we can, have a good idea of how well we did in relation to our others. So I appreciate the work from that standpoint, but I am very concerned that you've included, so much in here without verification.
Thank you, Senator Irwin. Vice Chair Tice, something very quick, please.
Thank you very much.
The House is up against a deadline we forgot about, so please.
I appreciate that. So I just wanted to make a point. I think we're getting way bogged down. I think the whole point of this is to determine what the death numbers were in the facilities that were subject to the executive order. And so that includes assisted living facilities. It includes a lot that's not included in here. And I would also challenge the point that your counts were not verified. I think it's obvious from your report that there was a lot of attempt to verify. So thank you.
Thank you, Senator Tice. And to Senator Irwin, my apologies for interrupting you earlier. And to Senator Chang, I'm sorry I missed your name here for a second. But if you could please be very brief, because the House is up against a deadline and we're imposing on them. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here. Appreciate your work. I do respect the work that your office does. I think it's very important. One of the things I am wondering, though, is how often your office does a report that goes beyond what a department is actually required to do. This seems sort of out of line with other reports that I've seen from your office. And so I guess, is this an outlier? And a follow-up question to that, I'll just ask all the questions at once, is if I was to write a letter and ask you specifically to do a report asking about whether or not the department accurately reported the COVID deaths in long-term care facilities as required by using CDC and other statutory definitions, what would be the conclusion of that report? So the first question is this an outlier in terms of going beyond what's actually statutorily required and using definitions that are the department is actually using? And two, if you were to do a different report that is actually about what they're required to do, what would the conclusion be?
Certainly the normal audits that we do are of a program or of an activity, and certainly there are criteria there that we audit against. But in this particular case, it was a request that came from a legislator, and we attempted to answer the question that was asked of us. So certainly, whether it was you or any of the other members of the legislature ask us to do the same thing, the way that you framed that question to us, when we get those legislative requests, we kind of take and look at 4 criteria. First of all, can we answer their question? Second of all, do we have access to the information to do that? Whether it's within our authority to do that. 3, does it align with the risk of the other activities that we're currently doing? And then lastly, do we have the resources to pull off that type of a review? So Laura has some stats on some of the numbers, the legislative requests that we've had here recently to try to address the other portion. Senator, your question? Go for it.
Yeah, for the letters like this, we've done about 8 of those since 2016, and we work with the legislator that's requesting to try to get to the bottom of to get to the answers for their questions. Sometimes it's strictly a long criteria that's developed in law, and sometimes it's looking for something a little bit more to decide if we need a different law. And also in our reports, a lot of times we will have an observation where, we've audited an agency. A really easy example is, and they're collecting fees in accordance with the law, but those fees haven't been updated since, say, 1982, and all the surrounding states have a higher fee. Well, we can't really say they aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing, but we will add an observation in the report that says we think they should work with the legislature because the fees are outdated. So it's not uncommon for us to go above and beyond and recommend something that we think is an opportunity for improvement or something that will address a risk beyond what's required of the department.
One more.
Please be very quick, Senator.
Okay. Sorry, just really quick follow-up, just to pick up on what you just said. In terms of recommendations, given what you have in this report, would you recommend that if we are going to take a look at this comprehensive list, that we should actually update our statutes to say, here are all of the things that are required, and should we make sure that we're using definitions that are aligned across the board? And should we make sure that there's enough money to make sure that we actually can do the work that we're supposed to be doing?
Well, in this case, we didn't do an audit, so we'd have to probably gather some more information to support that. I do know if you're looking at the director's letter that she sent us at the end, she does have some suggestions for some maybe opportunities for improvement in this area, maybe a new system, maybe some new laws. So I think if we probably aren't in a position because we didn't do a full audit to say that today, but there probably is opportunity for improvement in the collection of the data.
Thank you, Senator Chang. And just as an example, one of my former colleagues in the House, Senator, as well as a colleague in the Senate with him, Senator Thomas, we did the Flint investigation, and the Auditor General was part of that. Representative DeAnd asked for an investigation on the closure of prisons, and there was a report done from the Auditor General in that regard too, similar to this work. So it's not unprecedented in any means. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Back to you.
Thank you guys for being here. Thanks for your independent analysis. I appreciate the work you've done here.
Thank you for your time.
Up next, we have DHHS Director Hertel to respond to this report.
Apologies. Will you bring my phone up here? Thank you. This isn't working. Good morning, Chairman Johnson, Chairman McBroom, and members of the House and Senate Oversight Committees. As you know, my name is Elizabeth Hertel, and it is my honor to serve as Director of the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. I am here today to discuss the Auditor General's recent report on the COVID-19 deaths at long-term care facilities. Before I get into the bulk of my testimony this morning, I want to acknowledge the tireless work of staff in Michigan's nursing homes, homes for the aged, adult foster care facilities, local health departments, hospitals, and our other frontline healthcare workers who were and continue to fight this virus under impossible circumstances. All of the people that we've lost as a result of COVID-19 are significant to their families, their friends, their workplaces, congregations, communities, and to our department. And their deaths are a tragedy of this virus. The individuals and families we serve in all 83 counties are central to our work and to our decisions. The department takes seriously our duty to report the best information possible available to us in a way that honors the memory and the dignity of the people we've lost to COVID-19. Throughout this pandemic, significant differences in opinion have been shared about the exact path forward, but I continue to believe that we all care about the health and well-being of the people we mutually serve. That is why it is important that we not only look at the report published by the Auditor General, but also that we all understand, acknowledge, and be transparent with Michiganders about the reasons that the Auditor General's count differed from the data that the department has published. We appreciate the Auditor General's recognition of the fact that we accurately compiled and published the long-term care COVID-19 death data supplied to us from long-term care facilities, as well as their recognition of our work ensuring the reasonableness and integrity of the data that we've reported. However, what the Auditor General published is not comparable in any way to the data that we publicly share. Prior to sharing the review with Representative Johnson, the Auditor General's staff gave us an opportunity to respond and highlight the major concerns that we do have with this report. One of the major flaws of the Auditor General's report, and something that is clearly misleading, is the application of definitions that do not align with federal and state statutory and regulatory requirements and appear to have no basis in these or any other standards. While differences in the public perceptions of what a long-term care facility or nursing home are, state and federal regulations are crystal clear, and we welcome opportunities to engage in conversations on topics such as this and answer questions. However, when we and the long-term care facilities report deaths, or the OAG, the legislature, or anyone else analyzes that information and develops conclusions, it is critical that we all use the same definitions and apply the same factual standards. Changing definitions will inevitably include different sets of data and yield different results. It is important that we are consistent in our language and our definitions, just as it is an important foundation for collecting and reporting data, especially when this data is of an emotionally charged nature. The department follows national standards and definitions to identify how and from who to collect information. So for instance, the definition developed by the National Healthcare Safety Network as a reportable long-term care COVID-19 related death is defined as a resident who died from COVID-19 related complications and includes resident deaths in the facility and in other locations in which the resident with COVID-19 was transferred to receive treatment. Residents not expected to return are excluded from this count. However, the Auditor General's report cites a definition of COVID-19 deaths from the World Health Organization, and it does not specify how it is defining a long-term care COVID-19 death. There are significant differences between the definition developed by the CDC, the definition that we are using at the department, and the definition potentially applied by the Auditor General. Unlike the CDC definition, the OAG included in its tally individuals who have been discharged from a long-term care facility prior to their death, including former residents who recovered from COVID-19 and then were returned home, individuals who were hospitalized for a non-COVID-19 related reason and then contracted COVID-19 outside of the long-term care facility, or individuals who did not reside at a long-term care facility that was required to report. The total differences represented in the Auditor General's report are not due to miscounts or misreporting by the facilities to DHHS, but by changing core definitions of what the state required for reporting and what the OAG chose to include in the legislative report. I think it's important to acknowledge that nowhere in the OAG's report did they use the word undercount. Their report found that we posted all data that we received transparently and accurately. So as you continue to consider this report and my testimony today, here are some additional relevant definitions. The Social Security Act defines skilled nursing facility as an institution that primarily engages in providing to residents skilled nursing care and related services, rehabilitation services, for the rehabilitation of injured, disabled, or sick persons, not primarily for treatment of mental disease, has an effective transfer agreement, and meets the requirements for a skilled nursing facility in other sections. A nursing home is defined in Section 1919 of the Social Security Act as an institution or a distinct part of an institution that is primarily engaged in providing to residents skilled nursing care and related services who require medical or nursing care. Rehabilitation services, not for mental health disorders. At the state level, our state statutes define the following definitions: nursing home and skilled nursing home. It means a nursing care facility which includes county medical care facilities that provide organized nursing care and medical treatment to 7 or more unrelated individuals. It defines medical treatment, and it excludes a number of other facilities, including hospitals, veterans' homes, hospices, as well as incorporating skilled nursing facility into that definition. Adult foster care is defined by the Adult Foster Care Licensing Act and has a number of different levels, such as an adult foster care congregate facility, which cares for more than 20 adults. It is a home that provides foster care to adults, generally who are aged, mentally ill, developmentally disabled, or physically disabled, who require supervision on an ongoing basis, but who do not require continuous nursing care. A nursing home is specifically excluded from that definition. It then goes on to define different levels of care for those adult foster care facilities, including an adult foster care family home, which is a private residence approved to receive at least 3 but not more than 6 adults. An adult foster care large group home, which is licensed to receive at least 13 but not more than 20. And an adult foster care small group home, which is a facility approved to care for at least 3 but not more than 12. And finally, a home for the aged is defined in the Public Health Code to be a supervised personal care facility at a single address that is not a hotel, an adult foster care, hospital or nursing home, or a county medical care facility, and provides supervised personal care to 21 or more unrelated, non-transient individuals age 55 and older. Specific to nursing homes, CMS then outlines the regulations for reporting on their website, and we adopted those data fields and standard and definitions for our homes for the aged and our large adult foster cares. Finally, the CDC definition of surveillance is an ongoing systematic collection, analysis, and interpretation of health-related data essential to planning, implementation, and evaluation of public health practice. The data that our department collected and the federal government self-reported by facilities using these established definitions. Facilities that report data have every reason to report accurate numbers to the department, not only because they take seriously their responsibilities for their residents and their families, but also because knowingly misreporting any information could cost them their license and their federal funding. They take this seriously, and we continue to work with Michigan State University on an ongoing basis to reach out to facilities who are required to report, to do everything to ensure that they had the necessary tools they needed to do so accurately. In addition, we meet regularly with representatives of Michigan nursing homes to discuss reporting requirements and identify any questions or challenges they may be experiencing. Throughout the pandemic, we clearly stated what would be included in our COVID-19 long-term care facility death data, and we were upfront about what deaths were and were not included in that count. Without a similar proper case review as part of the OAG research process, it would be impossible to determine accuracy. That could best and most accurately be achieved by the Auditor General separately auditing individual level records attributed to each reporting facility and based on residential history and medical records. This did not occur. In addition to utilizing these definitions, this report includes information about facilities that are not required to report and combines the data of reporting and non-reporting facilities. It's important to remember there is no requirement under current law for all facilities defined in the OAG report to collect information such as name, date of birth, or date of death, and certainly not to report that back to the department. Some of the great confusion and mischaracterization comes from this point. It is acknowledged in the initial request letter that some facilities are not included in the long-term care reporting requirement, and that is not something that we have disputed because due to the size, nature, and requirements of some facilities, there is no requirement that they report. The inclusion of those facilities to report to MDHHS or follow the federal standards will, of course, change those total tallies. If actions were taken to establish a reporting requirement for facilities, it's important to note that privacy implications could arise at smaller facilities where it is more difficult to publish vital information without compromising resident rights. And finally, we utilize and maintain numerous IT systems, many of which are specific to public health. Each system serves a different purpose, and due to a decades-long lack of investment in technology and systems, despite numerous requests, many are using technology that has no interoperability between our systems. In this report, the Auditor General relied on the Michigan Disease Surveillance System, which is a tool specifically used for surveillance to enable case investigation, contact tracing, and disease exposure notification. It is not a tool for the tracking or collection of nursing home deaths. We have tried to use this system as a source of nursing home death information, but we found that it has a number of faults, and therefore we have not relied on it for this information. I do appreciate that the Auditor General did acknowledge our disagreement over the use of this system. The concerns that we expressed included the accuracy of the checkboxes, the MDSS long-term care facility variable is completed by the local health departments during case investigation. The case investigation may not be accurate in their assessment of what a skilled nursing facility is compared to another facility not required to report. This data is not validated to determine accuracy. Addresses in the MDSS are entered as free text as opposed to standardized fields, which leaves addresses open to unintended human error and may make address matching difficult. The addresses associated with cases in the system come in via electronic lab report for routing to the appropriate local health department. The address may be incomplete, and in some cases, may be the address of a provider instead of the address of a patient. It could also reflect the address of a visitor testing at a reporting facility. In addition, old address information is not deleted if cases have multiple addresses. Large communities, this has been mentioned before, many communities for older Michiganders do include multiple levels of care as a person's needs or wishes change. They are referred to as continuing care retirement communities. For example, we do have one near here in East Lansing that includes an independent living facility, assisted living, long-term skilled nursing, post-acute and short-term rehab, and outpatient therapy. I'm sure you're all familiar with similar types of living communities in your districts. The address that matches a nursing home may also match an independent living facility. Due to the lack of interoperability of systems, case information in the one system is not necessarily validated against charts to determine which type of facility a patient was living in. Finally, the timing of infection in MDSS does not reflect whether a patient contracted COVID-19 in the hospital. It is a snapshot of a case based on documentation such as lab reports and case investigation. Therefore, the address of patients who are residents of skilled nursing may reflect their residential address, even if they were not infected at the facility. A full case investigation must occur to understand the timing of symptom onset, exposure, and more information would be needed from our hospitals to understand when an infection was contracted. Often this level of detail is not available in this system. It is not intended, nor is it designed to be a longitudinal view of a person's medical journey. We remain ready to work with the state legislature on investments that will update our existing systems and fill gaps, but doing so will require meaningful investment in public health infrastructure. Without it, there will continue to be limitations, not due to our staff or facilities, but due to pervasive and multi-decade lack of investments in systems and infrastructure improvements that could make reporting easier, more efficient, and improve transparency. All of the deaths that we've experienced from COVID-19 matter. The people who are behind these numbers and their families, whether a facility was required to report to us, whether they were included in our statewide COVID-19 data, matter. The suggestion that a facility or the department intentionally misrepresented or miscounted numbers when the differences between the standards that we follow and the definitions that the OAG used in the report are clear, when the other limitations I described today are clear, is deeply disappointing. It does a grave disservice not only to our local long-term care partners, local health departments, healthcare providers, medical examiners, and state civil servants who work tirelessly for the people of Michigan, but most importantly, to the families who are grieving loved ones. Instead of perpetuating inaccurate comparisons, I hope the members of this committee will acknowledge the irrefutable differences and limitations that I have outlined. Differences and limitations that are also acknowledged in our conversations with the Auditor General, and continue to work with us to improve our data systems and to serve the people of the state of Michigan. Thank you.
All right, one quick piece of housekeeping here. The House technically has session at noon, so we will go at ease at 11:59. There's no votes taking the House, so we're hoping we just have to wait a few minutes, and then we'll get permission to come back here. So just to let you know what's going on the House side. It seems to me like you're resting much of your case against this report on those facilities required to report and those not, saying this is including a lot of facilities that are not required to report. I understand that, and we've been over this. To reiterate, the purpose of this discussion is in response to EO 2020-50 that placed COVID-positive patients into long-term care facilities. I go and look at that definition. Long-term care facility means a nursing home, home for the aged, adult foster care facility, or assisted living facility. As we want to go through and determine the wisdom of this EO, would it not make sense for us to have a proper accounting of all of those facilities, not just what the federal government requires?
I think as indicated in the Auditor General's report, assisted living facilities were removed from that definition. We are not tracking those deaths.
I understand. That's why I'd like to have those as well. But you'd have to agree to just take the number that you guys have self-reported to you isn't enough information for us to weigh the wisdom of Executive Order 2020-50.
Long-term care includes nursing homes, adult foster care, and home for the aged. That's what we can consider to be long-term care, and that is what we track and regulate.
Right, but you didn't give us the numbers from all those. And you're trying to attack this report saying it's including these facilities that aren't required to report. Well, yeah, that's the whole point of my letter, is when you came before us on June 3rd, it became clear, all right, there's a number of facilities that aren't required to report, and I think you said about 90% of either adult foster care or home for the aged were reporting, so 10% weren't reporting. We're saying, well, if we're trying to actually get a good understanding of the wisdom of this executive order, we need this true count. So once again, wouldn't this actually make sense to get all those numbers?
We are tracking and referencing long-term care facilities. We define long-term care facilities as nursing homes, adult foster cares, homes for the aged. That is what we are tracking because that is what we regulate.
But the number you presented us did not give, you're saying you're tracking them, but you didn't give us the numbers from all those because they don't self-report.
Adult foster cares that are congregate care facilities, 13 or more. Homes for the aged that are congregate care facilities.
I understand. You've gone through the definitions here.
Those are long-term care facilities.
But there's a number of long-term care facilities that don't report, and you're trying to attack this report by saying, how dare they redefine what should be counted? But the whole point is to see the validity of this executive order, which included all of these facilities, even those with 12 beds or less. So, it seems to me like the number of deaths in these other facilities, to not count them, is almost to say like their lives weren't as important as the ones that were required to self-report.
If the purpose is to track long-term care, resident care, and deaths, we are tracking long-term care resident deaths. Those are included in what we are reporting. That's what I'm saying.
I feel like we're talking in circles here. Your 5,600 number does not include all the facilities that were subject to Executive Order 2020-50, correct?
That was revised, and so the numbers that we have are subject to those revisions with the definition of long-term care.
Right, but Executive Order 50 was in effect at one point in time. It applied to all of these facilities, correct? I'm looking at the definition here. It says
That
nursing home, home for the aged, adult foster care, assisted living facility.
And we were enforcing that for nursing homes and adult foster care facilities at the time. We were never addressing assisted living facilities and ended up revising that definition because of the limitations of defining what an assisted living facility is.
So you're saying it applied to some of these facilities, but you didn't actually enforce it?
That's exactly right.
Okay. Now I talked to some of these facilities because that's one of the talking points out there. Not all these facilities knew that. They are still regulated by the state, and they're terrified of losing their license. And so they see an executive order out there that technically applies to them. They're told, well, we're not going to enforce it. But man, if we break the law here, we could lose our livelihood. We could lose our facility. So even though maybe you weren't enforcing it, it had the force of law. It was an executive order. It was written down. And the whole point is to try to figure out what was the true count of long-term care facility deaths. There's only a few states that did this. This is obviously a controversial issue as we're trying to determine the wisdom of Executive Order 2020-50. Wouldn't you want to have that true count?
I don't think I understand your question. If we're talking about assisted living facilities, they are not regulated by the state. They wouldn't lose anything if there was no enforcement on this.
Yeah, we want to know the true count of those that were subject to the executive order. The number you presented to us does not reflect that because there are certain facilities in there that don't have to report. That's a fact.
Adult foster cares, homes for the aged, and nursing homes, long-term care facilities.
Were there facilities subject to the executive order 2020-50 that did not report numbers?
At the time, between the time that went into effect and the fall, yes, absolutely. And
So would it not make sense for us to go back and see what those numbers are?
We had to put together reporting systems in order for those facilities to report to us. So we began with the
We've got a
skilled
timing
nursing
issue. I got to go at these real quick. I think we can let the Senate still take this going up. So with that, the House Oversight Committee will go at ease, call the chair.
The Senate Committee on Oversight will go at ease to call the chair.
Streaming now, this is the Wood TV Live Desk.
Now, every death is important, but 128 out of over 8,000, and we're saying there's 128 that are in question, potentially. Not that they're all bad, we just don't know. I mean, isn't that a pretty small number? We're considering things here to be disputing a whole report over?
No, we believe there's a much larger number than that included in the count that they have. They did not check each of those addresses and the names to verify that they were in fact the skilled nursing facility or a larger campus.
I mean, according to the report here, the ones that they couldn't match, that they could only match to a campus was only 128.
I don't believe that that's what that means. And again, we know that there are addresses included in their count that they did not verify against a skilled nursing home or a
When they come back
campus.
up, we'll want to ask them that question, because that's my understanding. With that, I'm going to go Representative O'Malley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a simple question. I hear a lot of statistics and political discussion of this, that, or the other. Let's go back to when all of this was happening. And I heard over and over and over, we're following the science and the data. This is data. I also understand that there were some of these facilities that reported and some that didn't. They didn't have to, whatever the reason, but they existed. And I don't really care about, at this point, remember, back when it was all happening, I don't care what falls under a definition. We were putting people into buildings with old, sick people. Doesn't matter if it was this, that, it fell under this definition. They were old, sick people. And I guess my question is this. When whoever was following the science and data and you got this report, did anybody say, well, there are others out there that haven't reported. Should we get on the phone and call some of these people to get a little more data? Because I think that's where you failed. I don't know if the term is lazy, overlooked, I don't know what. But yes, you got the report and you can stand and say this is what we got because they were supposed to report. But there were others out there with old sick people in there that didn't have to report, but they still existed. Did you call anybody, have anybody, an intern, call and say, what's your reports, to get that more inclusive data?
That's a good question. So a couple things. To clarify, when we talk about long-term care facilities, an adult foster care isn't necessarily full of old, sick people.
You get what I'm saying.
I do, but I think it's an important distinction in that it could be a home with very young, healthy people who may be intellectually disabled.
But you could, did you call any of these places?
We work through our CMHs, the community mental health agencies, who work with those adult foster cares to ensure that those facilities had what they needed to care for their patients. We didn't ask them to report specifically because when we are talking about getting information from smaller facilities, we are concerned about the ability to the privacy of the individuals in those homes. So that's what's important here, is that we are looking for information that can give us an overview of what's occurring in congregate care facilities without compromising patient privacy.
But I don't see, did anybody die isn't hurting anybody's privacy in the sense that we're, and again, I realize at this point I'm not asking that you're filling out some federal form. You are sitting in a room with your team making decisions for the entire state. You've enacted an executive order that, as the chair said, everybody assumed that they had to follow at the very least, and so they were. And so one of my concerns is, did anybody raise their hand and say, well, let's find out, let's ask the people that aren't reporting? I mean, they're there. They're not going anywhere. And it just, again, an informal, hey, great, you got all the PPE you need, everything's fine. Has anybody died of COVID there? That's not necessarily a report that has to be presented to God Almighty. It's one that you're trying to make this science and data, and you don't have all the data. That is the problem that the people of Michigan have. is that, and my concern, having watched all of this, was there this group of people that were so tight in following all of this that nobody else came in? I look at this legislature. I remember the day that the administration stopped taking our input. Was there anybody who might have walked in and said, hey, why aren't you asking the little guys who aren't reporting? Did that happen? That's our problem. And that's why we'd like just a simple answer and not hiding behind a report or, well, the definition. Did anybody ask? And it sounds like the answer is no. Am I right?
Unfortunately, I can't compromise patient privacy.
And that's, did anybody die isn't private. Well, I don't need a name, I just need to know.
I think that from a legal perspective of protected health information,
then we have major problems. And I think that, in my opinion, and I'll be done with this because I don't want to say anything I shouldn't, when you're trying to get that data and you're getting your reports that are legally sent in and lawyers will be happy, they got it, and you're on the phone with those other department or those other facilities that have people in it, I don't need to know who died, I just need to know, did they? That's all. Now you know that in the report you've got 100, and from the phone calls you made that you've got 15 more. Now you're not making a decision on 100, you're making a decision on 115 or 120 or whatever the number was. And I think that's the chair's point, is forget the bureaucratic bull. What were the numbers? And I don't think those questions were asked properly, and that's the problem I have, and I think many people in the state have. Mr. Chair, I'll be done. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for your comments. I think I have issues with the patient privacy. I think privacy is very important, so I would agree to safeguard that. But yet every day we were told how many people died of COVID. So clearly we had death data. You can't say, hey, we had 100 people die of COVID, 30 of them were in a long-term care facility. I don't think that's impacting privacy whatsoever. We're not saying tell us what specific facility they died in. So I guess I don't really follow that, but I'll hand it off to Senator Tice.
Thank you. I have a few points I'd like to make to start. Before I start asking my questions, it's important that we take a moment to remember what we're really talking about here. We're talking about a tragedy. We're talking about a bunch of people who lost their lives because of bad public policy. Only a few states in the country decided to use this public policy, and we were one of the last states to get rid of it. It's very, very clear that thousands of people were subjected to COVID-positive people in the most vulnerable populations. And I want to know what the actual outcome of that was. So to your point, Executive Order 50 said a long-term care facility must not prohibit admission or readmission of a resident based on COVID testing requirements. It defines long-term care facility to mean a nursing home, home for the aged, adult foster care facility, or assisted living facility, and that continued through October. The Healthcare Association of Michigan put out a letter that said that the entire concept of this EO breaks down because the regional hubs do not have the capacity to meet the needs for the long-term care facility. It says that the immediate effect of this creates a scenario where the long-term care facilities are not in a position to be able to properly care for the patients. It complains because the flaws of this executive order are blatant because they didn't bother to collaborate with the stakeholders. And it specifically says that it's extremely dangerous to the lives of residents. So the professionals that you're defending here, we agree. There were an awful lot of people who did everything they possibly could to try to maintain the safety of their vulnerable patients, but this executive order didn't allow them to. And to your point about them not being licensed, it was a misdemeanor. They did have legal ramifications associated with not following the executive order. So I think that's a really important point for us to take a look at. Who was affected by this bad public policy and why did it continue? So my question for you is, in the communications that were ongoing about this public policy and the decision to maintain it, was there any communication that said that this is a really bad public policy and perhaps we ought to try something different?
Well, I think it's important to acknowledge that it has been made very clear that no facility was ever forced to take a COVID positive patient, even after the issuance of that executive order. And I believe that your committee in the Senate came to that conclusion as well. We worked very closely with those associations and the nursing homes to make sure that they could not necessarily say, we can't take a patient because they're COVID positive. What we want to get to is, how can we make sure that you can take a patient who is COVID positive and that you have the resources that you need to do that. So we started with those skilled nursing facilities and the nursing homes because we believe that those are the people who are probably most medically frail, given the requirements needed to be admitted into a nursing home. And we continued to implement the policies as best we could to ensure the safety of both the residents and the staff in those nursing homes, and then working through to the adult foster care and homes for the aged.
I heard, if I might, I heard in my office of facilities where people weren't changing their gowns as they're going into the COVID positive place and coming out. There simply wasn't enough PPE, if you remember at the time. They were very limited in what they were able to do, also very limited in their staffing. They were doing the best that they had, but they were given an executive order with the threat of either licensure or legal ramifications associated with not following the rules. And while you might say that you weren't enforcing it, not all of them knew that. Again, not all of them are licensed, nor do they have actual direct access to the memos that you might be sending out with respect to it, but they most certainly knew about the executive order. It was publicized everywhere. So seniors were placed at threat from this. It was a huge concern, and we need to know these numbers. So going through the technical definitions, and saying, well, we didn't have to report because it doesn't technically follow the technical definition, except the executive order applied to them, to me is utterly insufficient an approach. And I honor the OAG for trying to get a better handle on it. Their hands are still tied because of the assisted living facility limitations. Thank you. I'll have more questions later.
I will come back to you. Representative Yarrick.
Thank you. I want to go to your letter, and I apologize. I got a few, if you don't mind, Chair. Going to your page 1, bullet point 2, your letter does not assess the accuracy of self-reported long-term care data. Who is the individuals that would be the individuals entering that data, that you're questioning the accuracy of that data?
The staff at the long-term care facility is required to report it.
And who would that include?
I would imagine in nursing homes it could include nursing supervisors or other administrators. At adult foster care facilities it could include the owner-operator. Just depends on who is responsible for doing that sort of reporting.
I see. So generally licensed professionals.
Licensed, facility licensed, yes, not necessarily
right,
health providers.
But all of them are operating under a license. You only, with the data that we're looking at, that you're arguing, your letter does not assess the accuracy of self-reported long-term care data.
Right.
And my question is, if you seem to imply that there's an issue with reporting data and its accuracy, and you question the Auditor General as to they didn't require facility by facility investigation. My question for you is, if you're questioning the accuracy of people who are, particularly licensed facilities, their accuracy in reporting, what are you doing or working with Laura to address those accuracy issues if we are questioning whether that's accurate data?
We are using data from a different data collection platform than they are. So we're talking about verifying the accuracy of the self-reported data. They're looking at the MDSS data, verifying for accuracy. So it's two different.
Because you're the one that raised this, so I'm asking the question, in what system are you questioning the accuracy of self-reported data, and what system is that data going into?
I am questioning the accuracy of the data going into MDSS. And that is not being updated by those licensed professionals. I'm sorry, I misunderstood your question.
So it's your system, it's DHS's system.
Yes.
MDHS. So you're questioning the accuracy of the people that enter it. What are you doing to deal with questions of inaccuracy? Because if they're inaccurately sending data, my question is, you're suggesting that there was, do you feel that there was intentional misrepresentation of the data that was put in?
I understand what you're saying. When we are talking about the Michigan disease surveillance system, the accuracy of the data that we are looking for to verify is the presence of a reportable communicable disease and where the person is or has been. Those are the two elements of that data system that are verified, and that is the purpose of the system. So at this point, we have no need to require further verification because we don't utilize that system for other purposes.
Okay, so I guess, but you also raised that we need to update our systems, but you say you don't really use that system, but you're also saying that they didn't, you're challenging the Auditor General that they didn't do a facility by facility investigation, nor are you doing a facility by facility investigation to determine the accuracy of that data anyway. So you're kind of challenging them for their issue of based on the use of your system and not questioning the people that are entering the system, but they're going to say, well, we don't use that system anyway.
We don't use that system for the purpose that the Auditor General used that system.
But if we have a system that we can't count on, then why do we even have a system?
Well, we do have a system we can count on. That is the self-reported system through EM Resource. The MDSS is not a system that is used to track death data. I think you're confusing our different platforms.
Well, either way, that's your platforms, and you've indicated these platforms are out of date,
yes.
And you're suggesting that the Office of the Auditor General should have done a facility by facility investigation, but if you're questioning the data that's being entered and the people that are putting it in, it's Laura and DHS that is oversight of the people that enter it, not the Auditor General. So if you're saying that they should be doing these investigations, they should have gone facility to facility because we're questioning the integrity of the data, then we have a system that we're maintaining that you don't trust the data that's going into it, or we need to fix the system.
I trust the data that's going into it that I need from that system.
But I mean, if we know, I mean, the point of, I think the Auditor General said, we're using the system to find who had COVID, and then you do a death record, and you go, oh, okay, we have a record that they had COVID, now they had death, now we can kind of match this up. We don't have a perfect system.
Right.
So, you know, so you're questioning of that system. It's that still, you know, I think the problem lies in Laura and you at DHHS if there's questions about that system, not the Auditor General using the system that you maintain. So I won't beat a dead horse on that. We'll move forward. Page 2. There's 3 bullet points under the first 3 bullet points in the center of the page. It says, we know your count includes the following cases that do not meet the definition of reportable COVID long-term deaths. And it says individuals have been discharged from long-term facilities prior to death. Their categories include former residents who recovered from COVID-19. Now, I had specifically asked the Auditor General whether they included former residents who had recovered from COVID-19, and basically said they were using your data, and no, they weren't necessarily using included people that had who had recovered from COVID-19, since you guys set the criteria. So my question is, what is your number that you're, first off, I think there's a glaring conflict between what you're saying they did and what they said they did, because they seem to say they didn't include people that had recovered, and you're saying they did. So that's a concern. Would you like to answer that?
Yeah, when the Auditor General staff went through their data with our staff, their indication to us was that they did include that. The response here today from them to you was the first time that I heard that that was excluded.
Okay, well, I mean, it was in their letter, and your letter speaks to their letter, to their position. So could you tell me then how many people you feel are in that category of former residents who recovered from COVID and simply returned to home with their families or were discharged to hospice?
No, I couldn't guess.
Okay, how many individuals who were hospitalized for a non-COVID-19 reason, such as a fall, then subsequently acquired COVID-19 outside the long-term care facility?
I couldn't guess.
Individuals who did not reside at a long-term care facility that were required to report but instead resided in a non-reporting facility on a shared campus, such as a continuing care resident community. Do you have a number for that?
Somewhere under 1,300 based on the data that they have.
Okay, so my concern with saying we know that your count includes, and you don't actually, that could be 1 or it could be 20. So you're discounting their data saying, well, there could be 1 in there that you did, so it's bad data, when in fact you don't really have data to show to the extent there was an issue in that.
Our goal is to report accurate data, so if it is off by 1, it's inaccurate.
Well, I think we have enough research to show that your data is inaccurate, because if long-term care doesn't include long-term care facilities, you stated included adult foster care, correct?
That we count 13 beds or more, yes.
Okay, so I'm a paramedic in addition to being an attorney. I will say that I don't count human beings, their value, based if it's 13 or 12. When I went to an AFC home, that life was the same whether they had 13 or 12. So the fact that we're saying, well, we're not counting it and suggest that it's not in the long-term care, I also think is ridiculous. I would like to question you. You made a statement of 15 years of disinvestment in IT. I'd like to draw to your attention a memo from February 26, 2019 from House Fiscal Agency. Over 15 years, as noted, the average increase over the same time period is probably 6.3% gross. There's been 3 recent DHS IT programs enter. It is clear that and that's not reading it out of there. Over the 15 years noted that we have made significant increases in funding in IT, particularly to some of the programs that the Auditor General used, Bridges and CHAMPS, both have been updated. Fortunately, because while term limits cuts me off in a year, I still remember giving the department $15 million because the department overspent money that was not appropriated to them, that they didn't have authorization, that we actually gave the department the $15 million even though they weren't authorized, and an additional $47 million that wasn't, that because they spent money that wasn't authorized, that we cleared up the books and appropriated it. So I struggle with, it would seem, having talked to House Fiscal, that we have been giving DHS the money to update their IT system. So it bothers me when you cite in your report the problem with our recording is out-of-date IT systems, and you, if I can go to your one statement, and finally, I would welcome your partnership in calling for legislative action to improve data collection and reporting in the future by investing in public health infrastructure. I will say that's frustrating because you said multiple times that the system is out of date and we haven't invested. It would seem that we are investing, and the choice not to invest in MDES or the other ones is actually DHS decision, because it would seem the legislature has been funding this. I also would like to bring up to your attention when we talk about the issue of investing in public health infrastructure. This legislature passed a stockpile bill to ensure that there was PPE because there was a shortage. We have approved a 2-month supply of PPE. The approach chair, Albert, I've discussed with him. He has an interest in funding it, and I made a request 2 months of your department, 2 months ago, to give me numbers on what it would cost to have 2 months of PPE. You have historical data to support it, and you haven't provided it. So I will say that I am particularly provided what it's going to cost for 2 months of PPE, and I will provide the emails to support that I've asked for it and not received it. But I struggle with this letter that throws the legislature under the bus like we're not doing what we're supposed to be doing, and it's very clear that we have been giving money, the necessary funds for IT to the department, and if it's not getting done, it's an issue of DHS not to have a system that's working. And clearly, as far as public health infrastructure, you know, I think there's a willingness to support making sure there's a stockpile so we're not out of PPE, and I still haven't received an answer. So I challenge you to continue to point the legislature as the problem in this.
Thank you for your comments, Representative. Representative Outman.
To give her an opportunity to answer whether she would like to correct her 15-year report of disinvestment in a system.
Do you want to respond to that?
No, I appreciate your comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Director, you said that you worked with stakeholders, but you had the largest stakeholder in terms of nursing homes in the state tell you that Executive Order 50 was not workable. Executive Order 50 was extremely dangerous. It led to unnecessary and excessive movement, and that the collaboration and communication between stakeholders and the department regarding Executive Order 50 was poor. But it continued. So my question is, who collaborated to create this policy?
I don't know. I couldn't answer that. I wasn't working on it at the time.
Were you part of the department at the time?
I was part of the department at the time.
Did you agree with this policy at the time?
I wasn't part of that policy discussion.
Did you try to push back in any way?
I know eventually we began working very closely with those stakeholders based on that letter, yes.
What was communicated back to the stakeholders, the ones that reached out regarding that concern?
We began, when I got involved, began working with them and listening to them on the challenges that they were facing and trying to figure out how to make sure that we could implement the policy in such a way that it didn't jeopardize the health and safety of residents, but also that we were able to find placement for people who needed it.
Do you believe this policy saved lives? Would you agree with Governor Whitmer's executive orders that mandated this?
I believe that making sure that people are in the right place with the right care was what was needed to save people's lives.
Okay. Were these facilities equipped to handle this sort of thing? Did they have HEPA filters? Did they have the proper amount of PPE?
Going facility by facility, working through implementing this, we were ensuring that they had the resources that they needed, and we continue to do so.
Thank you for your time.
Representative Young.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Madam Director, for being here with us today. Take a breath. I know we can be tough, but it's important because we're talking about Michiganders and we're talking about the lives of some of the most vulnerable, and those are our seniors. We like to call them seasoned citizens. So thank you for the work that you've done to try to be certain that they are well cared for. One of the things that I've been sitting here listening to, freshman legislator, here my one colleague, he's like, he's got 1 year to go, and I'm just in 1 year. And so I wasn't here at the very beginning of the pandemic. A lot happened, followed it through the news, but that's nothing like being here, right? And I know I read early on how there were reports that came out that said, the policy was okay. There were mistakes made, but they were made in good faith. There were no mistakes done intentionally to hurt somebody. That much I do believe we can agree upon. Nobody is intentionally trying to put people in harm, though hindsight is always 20/20. This is my biggest concern right now is when you look at data and when you look at different data points, you can come up with different results. This is what we found in this report, I think. As a preacher or somebody who studies scripture, people can use scripture to justify and to unjustify anything they want to. And sometimes you can find that same thing with data, depending upon what you're looking at. So for me to finally get to a place where we can all agree, what's it gonna take to get standardized definitions? We look at long-term care facilities and then it's broken down into all these different, and people have different opinions. When I'm talking to people at home, all they know is my mom doesn't live with me. She lives in a senior facility. It doesn't get into all this stuff that we're in. All they know is she's in a senior facility, and I want to be certain that that place is doing the right thing to keep her safe. And then we get into the weeds of, well, it was this kind, it was this kind, it was this kind, it was this kind. And the general public, I don't think really cares. But we need to care. That's our job. But I want to know, how do we make clear, even for the average citizen, what it means to be in these facilities and why it was important for you to report the way you did it. I'm one of those ABC 1, 2, 3 kind of thinkers, as well as teacher. I teach a bunch of stuff. And listening to this, I was just thinking about back during school days when you had a test of 100 questions, and then the teacher gave you like 5 bonus. If you had time to get to the bonus, then amen, but if you didn't, you didn't. And I'm just thinking about all the stuff you all had to do when it came to this reporting. You absolutely reported on your 100 questions. Would you say, does that sound right in terms of something? You absolutely reported on those 100 questions that you knew you had to answer, that you knew your grade was going to be dependent upon. You answered those 100 questions.
Yes.
Okay, I know, you follow me. So then we got these others, these bonus, which are people. So I'm not minimizing that. Now, what I'm hearing, I believe I'm hearing my colleagues say is, we now want the bonus questions part of the 100. So now the test is going to be a 105 question test. What is it going to take for us to do that? What is it going to take for us to now just be certain to include all of these so we get all the data, so that the AG's office is looking at the exact same thing that you're looking at, and we're all coming up with the same answers, or at least trying to.
What we would be looking for in order to implement something like that would be clear guidance on what is included and isn't included in each of those individual definitions, and a mechanism to compel reporting from those individuals, and a clear mechanism of how that should be reported.
So the guidance is legislation? Is that, are you proposing that we need to develop?
Because there is no standard definition of an assisted living facility, we don't actually know who is an assisted living facility. So I think if you could define that, it would be incredibly helpful to provide direction moving forward.
So we can, of course, work with you. You all are the experts in helping define that.
We could try.
We could try. Okay. And then when you talk about the, okay, Mr. Chair. When you talk about the mechanism, can you be a little bit more specific?
Yeah, when we set up reporting for the different types of facilities that are reporting, we were able to utilize one existing platform for the nursing homes to use, something that they were familiar with and had previously used sometimes. For the other homes, we had to set up a new reporting system for them to allow them to report into us. So we would either need to be able to expand on one of those or create a new one.
Okay. And do you have what you need currently in-house to do that?
I do not know. It depends on what the system would look like.
Okay, all right. Well, I'm going to trust you to let us know what you're going to need.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I just want to make sure I heard that right. So you said there's no, currently in law, there's no definition of assisted living facility?
Right.
So when you have the executive order saying this applies to long-term care facilities, and long-term care facilities are nursing homes, homes for the aged, adult foster care, and assisted living facility, you included a word that there's no legal definition for.
There is included in that initial one a word that there's no definition for.
Can you restate that again?
There is included in that initial executive order a word that there is no statutory definition for, assisted living facility.
So assisted living facility was in here, but there was no definition of what that encompassed.
That's right.
Is that a problem?
I believe that it was a problem, which is why it was rescinded.
How long did it take before it was rescinded?
I believe it was rescinded in October of that same year.
So this was issued April 15, rescinded in October. That's a long time for a gray legal area to be up in the open.
Again, I wasn't working on that policy, so I don't know the exact timeline that it was.
Right, and this wasn't from the department. This is from the executive office. This is Governor Whitmer. All right, Representative Hoytinga, do you have anything?
Thank you. I guess the most frustrating part is that this administration just never takes responsibility for anything. We even had a situation in New York where a governor said, we messed up. We messed up. We shouldn't have done it that way, and I'm sorry. And their state took it very well because he admitted he had bad policy. But we just kept going down the wrong road. And we can sit here and play semantics all day with definitions and stuff, but it's insulting to blame past administrations. We have been making investments. Money, 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 money. That's all this administration wants. Money, money, money will fix everything. Money does not fix bad policy. This was bad policy, and everybody knew it on both sides of the aisle, and we just kept going down that bad road. And then to hear you say you didn't want to count certain ones because we didn't want to interfere. I'm trying to get the quote. Tried to write your quote. We didn't want to, we cared about their personal health information, protecting them. But literally, we were contact tracing people. So we had almost everybody with COVID in a database already. We didn't care then when we were making those mandates. It's just, I guess I don't even have a question. Yeah, here's my question. Do you guys ever admit when you're wrong? We made some mistakes. Let's correct this instead of just pushing the blame everywhere else.
I will fully admit when I'm wrong and try to fix that. But in this case, we were reporting accurately on long-term care deaths.
So was Executive Order 50 wrong? Was that a mistake?
I couldn't speak to the executive order itself. All I can speak to is whether or not we were working with those facilities to make sure that they had the resources they needed to care for residents, and that is what happened.
Can you answer the question of whether or not it was appropriate to place COVID-positive patients into nursing homes?
Well, we never placed COVID-positive patients in nursing homes.
Yes, you did.
No, we didn't.
Yes, I've got people in my, I've talked to people that said, yes, we had to follow this order. I know you guys said, oh, we never enforced it. Just because you don't enforce something doesn't mean people thought you're going to enforce it. They're worried about losing their license. They're worried about a misdemeanor. And so they're here, all right, Executive Order 50, it says it applies to me, I got to follow it. I mean, we know this happened in facilities. So was that a mistake?
Fortunately, I wasn't part of that policy discussion. What I know, based on the policy itself and how we worked with the facilities, we did follow the data, we did follow the science, and we did provide the resources that they needed.
So let's say we get a whole other pandemic again. This all happens all over again, some other virus.
I certainly hope not.
Would you say, going forward, we should never put an infectious person of a disease like COVID purposely into a nursing home?
No, I wouldn't say that.
You wouldn't say that we should have that policy and not doing this?
No, what I would say is what we need to do is ensure that facilities who are caring for patients, and particularly medically frail patients, have the resources that they need to properly control for infectious diseases. And that is the purpose of working with facilities, to make sure that they can safely take residents back and care for them in a facility that is most appropriate for them.
I think the main goal of a lot of this was to ensure we don't repeat the same mistakes of the past. Quite frankly, with your comments, I'm not sure that that's the case, but we'll move on. Senator, let me go.
Thank you very much. From the question I had previously, I guess I didn't hear an answer. Well, clearly, I believe this policy was a problem across the country. That's what's come out. What communications were had at the time about changing policy? So whether verbal communications or email, what communications were had at the time about whether or not this was good policy?
Again, I can only speak to the communications I had directly with the associations on this, and the talking about the implementation of this policy and how we could support those facilities to do so.
So you were a part of the communications that were ongoing at the time about the policy?
After the effective date of that policy and working with facilities, because I was working on ensuring that healthcare providers had the resources that they needed to care for COVID patients.
Because I thought you weren't, but okay. So moving on, did the department contract with any third-party entity to help develop this policy and assist with communication and public relations regarding the deployment and/or implementation?
I don't know the answer to that.
I'm sorry?
I don't know.
At any point, did the director or governor, I know the director at the time was not you, question or show concern over putting COVID-positive patients into nursing homes? Because regardless of what you're saying, that was the directive in executive order.
Yeah, significant concern about COVID-positive patients anywhere. So in a nursing facility, in a hospital, in an individual's home, there were serious concerns about where and how we could care for all of the people who were COVID-positive.
So you talked about putting them in the right place with the right care. Is it your contention that a nursing home full of elderly, vulnerable people is the right place to care for someone who's COVID positive?
If they can properly isolate individuals and they are using appropriate infectious disease control policies, you can safely care for those patients in the same building.
Per the letter that you received, almost immediately, your department, almost immediately after the executive order from HCAM, they were not prepared to do that, and it had immediate effect. Mm-hmm. So it was not the right place with the right care because the people for whom it was applying expressly said they couldn't.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Senator Bison.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you, Madam Director, for being with us today. I have to presume that the department consulted with healthcare experts prior to Executive Order 2021-50. Do you know who those experts were and what their consult was in regard to this executive order?
Again, unfortunately, no, I wasn't involved in the drafting of such an executive order.
Who would know that answer?
I am not sure. I would have to ask internally on who is working on that.
I would love to have you back with that answer, ma'am. Thank you. And that's all.
Senator Irwin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Director. I appreciate you being here, and I appreciate you repeating and stressing what we heard at the Oversight hearings in the Senate over a year ago, which is that the department did not, in fact, require any facilities to take any COVID-positive patients, and that that executive order was something that subsequently the administration worked with the nursing home communities on to try to figure out how we could workably house folks who were COVID positive and who also needed a nursing home level of care. So I appreciate you stressing that point, because it keeps getting repeated that the state required these homes to take COVID positive patients when that's just not true, and we've already had that proven in a previous Oversight Committee hearing, but it just keeps coming up like a bad penny. So I appreciate you stressing that. I also appreciate the department's work over the course of the last couple of years. It's been tough. But I particularly want to highlight the work of the people in the nursing homes. This has been a really, really hard couple of years, and we were asking them in many cases to do an impossible job, and some of those folks make criminally low wages. So I just wanted to take a second to recognize them. Here's my question. I think that there's been a lot of talking past each other and, focusing on different, nits that we each want to pick. But I think the broad question is, how did Michigan do? Looking back, now that we can look back, how did Michigan do comparatively across the nation? And we don't want to compare apples with loaves of bread. Let's compare apples to apples. How did Michigan do vis-a-vis the other states? The research I've seen shows that our COVID deaths in nursing homes were substantially lower than the national average. So I just want to ask you to characterize, we know that this was a terrible, deadly pandemic, that COVID was killing people, even though some folks want to say that the governor was doing it. We know that COVID was actually killing people. Did COVID kill more people in Michigan nursing homes than the national average, or did COVID kill less people in Michigan nursing homes than the average?
I haven't looked that closely at it because we are not in a position to look back yet. We're still in the process of responding, as you know, to a current surge. But from the initial data that I've seen, our nursing home death rates do appear to be lower than the national average.
I appreciate your considered answer, because the studies I've seen show that Michigan's average was about 6% lower than the national average, which is about 25% of that total. So it's a pretty we've had substantially less nursing home deaths in Michigan than in other states based on the research from the Center for Healthcare Research and Transformation that I've read. And so I appreciate your answer saying that, we're going to have to let some more time go by, and we're going to have to continue to reconsider this data and be very, very careful about it, and you don't want to make a conclusion before all the data is in. But so far, the data shows that even though Michigan was at the front end of this COVID concern, even though we were getting hit hardest when people didn't yet know how to keep people alive, our numbers are still better than the national average. I think that's remarkable. I think that shows that some of the things we were doing here were right. And so I think that's true. I also think that there's probably some lessons we can learn, and I hope the department is fully engaged in that process. And the one thing I want to ask you is that there's been a lot of talk here today about the fact that we do not regulate all of these homes where our seniors are living in. And I've heard some concern that seems to maybe even be bipartisan, which is thrilling to me, because I think it would be great if the state legislature were to pass a law, not just defining assisted living, but also regulating it to protect our seniors. Is that something that the department could work on with this legislature so that we could actually regulate the full breadth of these facilities rather than focusing only on a few of them and then after the fact saying, wait, maybe we should have had our lens wider?
Yes, of course.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair Irwin. Director, thank you. I'm sorry that I was missing briefly for another committee. So if a couple of my questions seem a little bit redundant, I hope you'll bear with me. But, playing off of what the Vice Chair just mentioned, can you tell us, and based on what you already alluded, I think the answer, I know the answer, but can you tell us that when you compare our stats with that of the stats of other states, are we sure that we're making the same count comparisons?
Yes, because we are able to, based on the different types of reporting, compare the same definition. So we can compare nursing home deaths to other states. They use the same definition.
I mean, you're sure that's true across all the states, that they're all doing it the same way we are?
When it comes to nursing homes and skilled nursing facilities, absolutely yes.
Okay. Director, as I mentioned earlier to the Auditor General, when the Senate committee met with the department numerous times in the early parts of the epidemic, the department told us, we are not doing a good job counting right now. We don't have the systems in place. We're in panic mode, whatever it was. There was a lot of reasons for we're not doing a good job counting now. Is it your contention that the department has corrected those count numbers from those first months?
Yeah, we have been working very closely with all the facilities to make sure they understand what's included, what's not included, how to report, and that is continually updated as they, improve their data. And that happens on this and other data reporting as well.
No, but specifically, I understand that you're saying that's going forward, but I'm asking, were those 3 months corrected? Or are they still a black hole of we don't know because we weren't doing a good job then?
I think that they have been corrected. Yes, I think that the nursing homes would say that they have corrected that.
So throughout your testimony that I was here for earlier, and now these answers, I'm still having some confusion on how we can talk about the system needing improvements while also depending on self-reporting that the department's not auditing themselves. And I guess I want to know, why isn't the department auditing the self-reporting?
At this point, to audit the self-reporting, again, we're getting into confidentiality and privacy when we're talking about individual patient records. At some point in the future, it is the intention to go back through and try to do a one-to-one comparison of what's self-reported against our death records. At this point, we have not done that, but as we continue to move through the response to this pandemic and close out some of the emergency response and do that sort of look back, lessons learned, that is our intention.
So as long as we're continuing to completely depend on self-reporting, and on self-reporting that's not being audited, is it really, can you really contend so vehemently that the numbers are absolutely accurate and that the Auditor General's report is inaccurate?
Yes, I can, because I have faith in the facilities' intentions to follow the guidance required by them in order to receive the funding that they receive. So if at some point, for example, a skilled nursing facility undergoes a CMS investigation or a survey, and it is found that they were intentionally hiding deaths, they will lose their CMS certification, which means that they are no longer able to take Medicare patients or Medicaid patients, which means they will no longer be able to operate in the state.
Well, I understand that's true, but if they don't have to worry about an audit, and if you're comfortable with them self-reporting, I'm very concerned that the numbers that we're getting are not really being legitimized somehow in a proper fashion that we can count on. I mean, and to put faith in all of these facilities that there is no reason for them to misreport when there's no teeth threatening them right now, it seems unwise at best.
Every licensed nursing home undergoes regular surveys from CMS and from the state. So they all are aware that at some point there is a possibility, if they are falsifying information, on this or other requirements from CMS, that they lose the certification and they lose their license, which means they lose their business. So yes, because we trust them on other items as well, we trust them on this too. This is their livelihood.
No, I understand, but there's our committee, especially both of these committees, have been dealing with the unemployment agency, and we see people who purposefully misrepresent things and unintentionally misrepresent things. And if there's no auditing of the self-reporting going on, it might not be that these places are purposefully trying to do this or feel that they're in any danger of losing funding. They might think that they are meeting the requirements of the law. Without somebody coming down and doing a standardized audit of facilities, I'm concerned that the numbers that you're depending on can't be depended on by us.
Well, we don't undertake formal audits. We are in constant communication with the associations and the facilities to help them understand what the requirements are and how they report. So we go through this on this death data. We're constantly working with them. They're constantly learning and updating. We do it with other forms of data reporting too, where we contact them, we work with them closely to make sure that they understand in a way to be supportive of them. Again, there are regular surveys that can have adverse consequences if they are not following those guidelines. But I do believe that our nursing home operators and our AFC and Home for the Aged operators are doing what they can in the best interest of their patients and their families. And I do not believe that they would be falsifying information about the mortality of their residents.
Well, we're going to have to disagree, I think, on that, but I'll move on for a moment. In the Auditor General's report, 7,100 deaths in long-term care facilities. The state claims 5,675 deaths. It's about a 25% difference, a little less than 25%. In skilled nursing facilities, they found 5,253, whereas the state reported 4,199. Is it your contention today to these committees that almost the entirety of that discrepancy is based on them utilizing the MDSS system?
Yeah, I believe that universe of numbers is a universe that cannot be verified with the information that we have available to us, and it requires more information to verify.
And so your contention is that their numbers are over.
Yes.
Are too high.
Mm-hmm.
What is the... Well, that's a huge amount to be over by. Wouldn't it be pretty easy? I mean, it seems, I guess, can you give me more detail on why the MDSS system would create such an enormous disparity that's not readily apparent to people who do this work for a living? I mean, they collect statistics and provide reports. This is their job. This is what they do. Why the failure here in your mind?
The MDSS system is meant to identify where a disease has occurred and then utilize that information to prevent further spread. The information that is input into that is and can be continually updated for accuracy. The important piece of the information there is that we get the confirmation of a communicable disease so that we can then do the case investigation. Those other items, again, are useful to contact an individual, to update where they may be, to understand what local health department jurisdiction they are in, but that is not the fundamental use of that program. So if an address is incorrect or if it is not associated with the right type of facility, that is irrelevant in the MDSS data. And that is why we don't use that data set to report our long-term care deaths, because we know that that is not the purpose of that. It is why we set up the additional reporting mechanisms for the self-reporting. So what the contention that we are making is that the discrepancies that therein could be a result of any number of things, because we know we have so many people working in that system, we have so many people working on case investigation now, that we are not relying on the accuracy of that. The importance of that is the positive COVID-19 test to identify who had it and where it is and how we can case investigate and contact trace.
So you don't, I guess, you would put up against MDSS self-reporting?
Yes.
Okay. Director, in the last few days since this letter has come out, this report, you made some comments publicly that you felt that the OAG was politicizing this process. Do you still stand by those remarks?
I think that the way that long-term care has been defined, and I've said this publicly, is defined in a broader way than the actual definition of what long-term care is. And in doing that, you are absolutely going to come up with a larger universe of numbers because you've broadened that definition. The definition that we use for long-term care is very specific and very clear. Those are the guidelines that we are implementing, and those are the things that we can report on.
I mean, when you read us that long list of definitions earlier,
yeah,
they match the definitions that the Auditor General has here in the back. I thought you were reading from their report. I mean, they're the same things.
Aside from using a hospice, which is not included in long-term care, an assisted living facility, which is not included in long-term care.
Right, but obviously they didn't use assisted living. That's right there on the chart.
They do have that indicated in their chart, which is where that difference discrepancy comes from.
But they didn't count those. I mean, it says there's no numbers there on the chart, so I'm trying to figure that out.
They have the difference number of these facilities in there. They included hospice, they included people who may have been discharged, they included people who may have been contracted COVID outside of a long-term care facility. What we are saying is we believe that we need to further information on most of these cases in order to verify the contention that the Auditor General is making with their numbers.
So, to the original point of my question, though, just because there's a disagreement about a definition, and I'm still struggling to see whether that there is, and that the disagreement on the definition actually altered things, and I'll keep studying that, but to utilize the terminology that the Auditor General was politicizing the issue, is that a remark that you would still stand by?
I think that purposely opening up a definition to get a broader pool is telling a story that is untrue. Whether the motivation behind that is political or not, I couldn't say.
Well, you know that was written into the chairman's letter. It wasn't the Auditor General's choice. They responded to the ask from the chairman.
Yes, and those are the comments that I made publicly.
No, you accused the Auditor General of politicizing the process, not the chairman. Or, I mean, if you did accuse the chairman, maybe you did, but I'm concerned about anyone accusing the Auditor General's office of politicization who then can't come to me and definitively say where that happened, because that would be inappropriate and something that the legislature should take note of. And so if you are alleging that, I want to know that very concisely how that can be defined and what action needs to be taken to regard that.
I think if the Auditor General's office is putting information out there publicly, the information that they are putting out there should be accurate, and it should have citations to the types of guidance that the state departments are required to follow. Utilizing different guidance or expanding on that guidance outside of what the state's authority, the department's authority is misleading, and I think that's concerning.
Do you think that the numbers that the Auditor General is presenting, utilizing the definitions that they used, are inaccurate?
Yes, and I've stated that directly to the Auditor General multiple times.
Based off of, I understand that you believe that they shouldn't have used MDSS for determining this, but do you believe that their numbers based on the usage of that are inaccurate?
Yes.
Why?
Because it's not an accurate data source for the type of information they are looking for.
isn't it an accurate count of what was asked for?
No, that's not the purpose of that data platform.
I'll pass on Senator Chang.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the director. I had a question about, there was a mention earlier about New York and a mention about admitting wrongdoing or mistakes, I think it was the word. Would you agree that Michigan and New York, the situations are just completely different in terms of what happened in New York with intentional covering up of cases, intentionally withholding information about nursing home deaths, when in fact in Michigan, you have been following the law, following the requirements, using federally accepted definitions, and doing everything that you are required to do? What do you think about that comparison between New York and Michigan?
Those were very different situations. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Senator Chang. I'm sorry. Okay, Senator Tice, last one.
Thank you. Just a follow-up comment. You don't undertake formal audits, but find your audits to be more reliable than those from the Auditor General, whose job it is. I have an issue with that. But my question for you is, what was McKinsey & Company's involvement in developing nursing home policy, or MDHHS's communication regarding nursing home policy?
Again, I can't answer that. I wasn't involved.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, back to you.
Representative Riley.
Thank you. Yeah, I just had a question about, in your department, what's the methodology that employees can report on what they think are abnormalities? I mean, we're having this huge discussion up here about something we think is, wow, this is really standing out as an issue. So within your department, I got to imagine that people have seen what was going on here, this reporting style. What's the method that they can elevate this to? Is there a way that they can anonymously let people know, or what's the method that people can get this information to you or to somebody who can act on it?
In our department, we have an office of the Inspector General, and they can report anonymously there.
And has that ever occurred in the past?
I don't know. Those are anonymous, and they're not shared with me from the Inspector General.
So you have no way of knowing if any comments come to them. And is there any way to when people come forward like that, is there any way that if it's actually they did the right thing, that they're compensated for that?
If the Inspector General finds any allegations like that to be truthful, then yes, it is raised to whatever level is appropriate to address those situations.
I guess my point is, does the employee have a benefit to reporting these things? Is there any kind of compensation that they receive? Is there a promotion possibly in hand or something for actually calling out something that you see within your department?
I don't know of any formal policy like that, no.
Okay, thank you.
We have several members that would like to ask questions, but they've already asked. I believe you said you had to leave at 1. We're past there. Do you need to go?
I do.
Okay. We appreciate you staying. I know this is a lot longer than we expected initially, so we appreciate you doing that. I would like to invite the Auditor General back up to kind of discuss some of these things we have heard here. I'll give them a chance to step back up. I do want to just touch on the whole definition thing. The definition we use for counting is the same definition that was used in the executive order. The whole point of this is to decide the wisdom of EO 50. You can't decide that if you're only counting some of the numbers. We use the same exact definition. No one rewrote definitions. We did the same exact one that was in the EO. The numbers that we asked for are above and beyond what the federal government asked for. The reason for that is that Michigan was one of a handful of states that put COVID positive patients into these long-term care facilities. Because of this difference, we had to get a true count. So that's what happened there. I want to get to this MDSS issue. This keeps going back and forth. I'm going on to page 4. The department is basically calling into question all of these, which is over 1,000 deaths. According to your 85, you did a quick look and you're able to verify 85%. Looks like using Medicaid data in Bridges and in Champs. Can you talk about that and the reliability of those other fields?
Yes, thank you. So a few points on the 1,500 with the 85%. So as we kind of indicate here, we used the MDSS address field, and then other data sources. So first, the MDSS data field. There's additional fields in MDSS that we were able to corroborate. So essentially, there's 2 places in MDSS that both indicate a long-term care facility address. So that was one way that we were able to corroborate those, whether it was now name or address. Moving to the Medicaid beneficiary data in Bridges and the Medicaid claims data in CHAMPS, both of those data platforms also have identifying information of where an individual might be. So specific to Bridges, it's collecting information on individual people. So it's going to collect your name and your specific address. So again, that was one way that we could identify an address. More specifically within Bridges, if you are going to get paid, or if you're going to reside in a long-term care facility and Medicaid is going to pay for that, you need to indicate that as such. So there are specific screens within the Bridges system that indicate where and which facility with a name and an address that an individual is residing. And then specific to the long-term care claims in CHAMPS, those would be individual payments that are going out to the facilities. So if I reside in a long-term care facility and I'm on Medicaid, that facility is going to get a payment on my behalf. The CHAMPS system will indicate that facility ABC got paid $100 for Brittany. So you can identify the people within the CHAMPS system and also the specific facility that got paid.
So to make this abundantly clear, in the cases when we're talking about Medicaid money, if the person truly didn't reside there, you would have a facility getting money from Medicaid to serve a patient that actually isn't there.
That would be correct.
Okay, so this is 85% that you guys are able to verify very quickly. There's likely the chance to verify the other 15. The director was hoping that there is some way that they could see that verification. Are you guys able to present that to them in a way that they can know, hey, this is a legitimate double verification?
Yes.
Okay. I want to go back to another point, is dealing with the issue of an independent care facility that wouldn't fall under these being on the same campus as a skilled nursing facility. And they're saying, look, you have this one address that would apply to all these. We don't know what one they're in. The concern being brought forward by the department is that you could have individuals in this count who shouldn't be because they're in this campus. Am I understanding it correctly, looking on page 3, those facilities that you can't tie down to the specific facility, but rather the larger campus as a whole, would be the uncertain facility type with the 128 deaths? Or would it fall under other categories as well?
Well, we have that similar situation in a couple of different places, because in the top portion under the required to report, there's an other line item that would have that same circumstance, but those persons would have been within that category, so they would have been only in the top portion of the table. So the 235, they should have been, or they would have been in one of those line items in the top portion of the table, okay? And then we had the ones that are undetermined in the center of the table that would have either, should have been either, or I'm sorry, not should have been, they could have been in the top portion of the table or the bottom portion of the table. We couldn't tell. So we have that same circumstance in 2 different aspects of that table.
And just be clear, so that first one, that 235, I didn't reference that because those were self-reported. That's not something you guys went in and found later. Those were self-reported.
Yes, but then our work obviously had identified, 72 others on top of that.
Correct.
Okay.
And so then going down to that, so there wouldn't be, other than that additional 128, it is, would you guys say it's possible that 128, if there was an independent living facility on one of these campuses, it's possible that one of them could have been there if there was these other facilities?
Yeah, certainly, because there was no way of knowing exactly where on that campus they were residing.
But there wouldn't be someone in one of these facilities that wouldn't be in that 128, but that would be in one of these other categories. It's just that that bucket, other than the 235 that was self-reported.
Say that one more time, please.
Okay. There's the allegation being made that, we've got about 2,400 extra deaths that we're finding, and they're saying a lot of these are in these facilities that weren't long-term care facility, like an independent living facility. Okay. The way I'm reading this, the only one that they could be in would be that uncertain facility type, which is 128 deaths. So they're at worst, let's say every one of them was truly an independent facility, shouldn't have been counted. At worst, you're 128 over.
I think that's fair. Would you guys agree? Okay.
Okay. Do you have any questions from your side? Representative Yarrick.
So when we talk about those other facilities, again, I'm very familiar with this. So we literally have facilities where I used to respond, where one wing was assisted living and the other one was senior housing. But so I assume, or in fact, we had a nursing home, assisted living, and senior apartments on the same piece of property, potentially with the same address. But did we look at, maybe you did, I want to clear, the CPT codes? Because the CPT code for nursing home care is going to be different than a senior who's living in a senior apartment who's not applying for that CPT code.
I don't know, Brandon, do you know the answer to that?
There's certain codes that qualify you, that you apply for, that you're going to get Medicaid, Medicare reimbursement for the fact that you're in a nursing home and you're getting skilled care, versus a same complex may have a senior living wing, but they are not going to be qualified for that CPT code because they're not getting skilled care. They're a senior living in the wing that is senior living, independent living, that's separate. So was there a breakdown? I don't have the CPT codes memorized, but looking at those CPT codes, and if I missed in the report, I'm sorry, but it would seem that when we break those up, we could be able to digest further.
Yeah, so we did not look at the specific medical codes that would have been associated to it. One of the limitations would be the data available to us. So we would have the data available to us to look at the Medicaid beneficiaries coding. However, there's a number of individuals who reside in long-term care facilities who are not Medicaid recipients, and therefore we would never have been able to obtain that type of level of medical coding for all the rest of those individuals.
Okay, I mean, obviously there's no perfect way of getting there, but I'm saying when you have a facility that has senior living and a separate wing that's, Medicaid eligible, that there would be a differentiation on CPT. But thank you very much.
Representative Young.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Before the director left, I was going to ask her, I wanted to know what type of guidance and assistance the department was offering to our long-term care facilities to make things better. Should we ever have another type of health emergency like this? I think it's still important just to get an answer to that question, so I just wanted to put it out there for transparency. I'm going to follow up on that. But for you all, during your review, did you run across any data that showed how many residents who were COVID positive actually were returned back after being discharged from a hospital, returned back to one of the long-term care facilities? I know you didn't report it, but did you see it? Does it exist in something that you may have seen, but because you weren't required to report that, I'm just trying to figure out what's that universe look like?
Yeah. So we did inquire to MDHHS about obtaining admission and discharge data for these individuals to try to do a further analysis. They indicated to us that data was not available to them, so at that point we weren't able to obtain any of that specific admission and discharge information.
And did they say why it wasn't available? I'm curious to know. Is it part of that self-reporting issue?
I would have to defer to the department on specifically why they weren't able to provide anything to us.
Okay.
Thank you. And to your first question to the department, Representative Young, if you get an answer, I'd like to see that answer. Thank you for that. Representative Brixey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, I feel like this hearing is a bit like us yelling at DHHS for not giving us data 2 years ago that we never asked for, and now we're mad that the department can't read our minds. I'm all about fixing stuff, and that's part of our job as legislators. So having gone through the pandemic and being frustrated with lots of things about it, what should we do? We're sitting here armchair quarterbacking rather than problem solving. And what I'm hearing is it sounds like folks here at this table want some regulations in place for independent living facilities and assisted living facilities in order to protect the vulnerable people that live there. And so if that's what we want to do, we should do that. I know that my colleague, my former, I guess I can say former colleague now, my former colleague, Mayor Hammoud, had introduced legislation similar to that in 2017, and it never got a hearing. And a similar bill was introduced in 2016 and also never received a hearing. So, you know, if we want to do something, let's do something, right?
Okay. I don't have any other questions on our side. Do you have anything, Senator?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to mention that I'm not exactly sure how the work that the committee undertook less than 2 years ago wasn't asking these questions at the time. At this time, Senator Wozniak has a question.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Ringler, for your testimony. Iatrogenic medicine. You familiar with that term? Not anybody? No?
We have CPAs after our names, not...
Okay. Well, iatrogenic medicine actually can kill more people than COVID on a yearly basis. And it seems to me that part of this routine that we had to send people into assisted living, nursing homes, et cetera, could be considered iatrogenic in that it wasn't the correct treatment at that time. But unfortunately, you don't know the definition, so I won't go into it. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Wozniak. To the Auditor General, I guess, you know, I asked the director if she felt that the numbers that you reported were too high. I want to ask you directly, do you feel like the numbers that you reported represent a true count of deaths or not?
Yes, we do. We did an analysis in black and white. We have identified what it was we did. We identified the pluses of our work. We identified some of the warts that existed from trying to do data analytics. It's there in black and white. We said what we mean what we said. I guess I don't know what else to say.
Can you explain to me number 4 on page 7? In light of the director's insistence that self-reporting is working great, that they're absolutely confident of those numbers despite not conducting any audits themselves of the self-reporting system, that you report here that they've had to run the numbers on 3 separate times. Now all of a sudden the third time that's rock solid? I mean, is that...
What we reported here was to provide some balance in our letter and to indicate what the department has done. I can't really speak to the specifics of that, why that failed, or even anything that's transpired since they provided that information to us. I think that'd be better asked of them.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry about that.
No, I understand. It's a fair point. I have no other questions from our committee. Mr. Chairman, shall I adjourn? Okay, seeing no further business from the Senate Oversight Committee, Vice Chair Tice moves to adjourn. Hearing no objection, we're adjourned.
I would just like to reiterate our thanks to the Auditor General's office for your work. When you do a report that people don't like, they trying to attack it, try to find holes in it, but at the end of the day, this is the most comprehensive report we've seen so far in nursing home deaths. I thank you for your time and diligence into doing this. Not an easy task. I know we'll have conversations further as to what makes sense as to our next actions. Thank you, committee members, for your questions today. Seeing no further business before the House Oversight Committee, we are adjourned.